Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's darkest secrets, a world where women faced a terrifying choice between death in childbirth or death from the very methods they used to prevent it. Imagine being so desperate to avoid pregnancy that you'd willingly drink mercury, insert copper shards into your body, or consume herbs that could stop your heart. This wasn't fiction. This was medieval reality. For over 1,000 years, women risked everything using birth control methods so dangerous they make modern horror movies look like bedtime stories. Tonight, you'll discover shocking truths about medieval contraception that will change how you see both history and the privileges we take for granted today. If you're settling in for tonight's story, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if it truly resonates with you. I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Your bedroom, your living room, maybe while taking a late evening walk? Drop a comment and let me know. I genuinely love hearing from you. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back nearly 8 centuries to uncover some truly shocking history together. Picture this. It's 1347, and you're a 25-year-old woman named Eleanor living in a small English village. You already have 4 children, and winter is approaching. Your family barely has enough food to survive, and another mouth to feed could mean starvation for everyone. But here's the terrifying reality. You have absolutely no safe options. The methods available to you would make your skin crawl. There's the local wise woman who whispers about drinking a concoction made from mercury and wine. The same mercury that would slowly poison your organs and drive you mad. There's talk of inserting sharpened pieces of copper into your womb, a procedure that killed more women than childbirth itself. Or perhaps you'd consider the gentler option of consuming massive doses of herbs like tansy or pennyroyal, plants so toxic they could stop your heart in minutes. This wasn't some primitive ignorance. Medieval women weren't stupid, they were desperate, and their desperation led them to embrace methods that modern medicine would classify as attempted suicide. Let me paint you a picture of just how dangerous medieval life was for women. Historical records from 14th century England show that nearly 1 in 3 women died from pregnancy-related complications. That's roughly 300 deaths for every 1,000 births, compared to about 17 deaths per 100,000 births in modern America. Imagine those odds for a moment. Every time a medieval woman became pregnant, she was essentially playing Russian roulette with her life. But here's what makes this even more heartbreaking. These women knew the risks. They weren't ignorant about the dangers of childbirth. Medieval midwives kept detailed records, and word travelled fast in small communities when another woman died in labour. Women watched their mothers, sisters, and neighbours die regularly from complications we can easily treat today. So when faced with the very real possibility of death from pregnancy, the alternative methods, no matter how dangerous, seemed like reasonable gambles. It's a twisted logic, but when you're staring down a 30% chance of dying in childbirth, drinking mercury might not seem so crazy after all. The most popular contraceptive of the medieval period was actually silphium, a plant so effective and so desperately sought after that it literally went extinct from overuse. This wasn't some folk remedy passed down through generations of village women. This was serious business. The Romans valued silphium so highly that it was worth more than its weight in gold. Literally. Archaeological evidence shows that silphium was traded for silver denarii at a rate that would make it worth approximately $5,000 per ounce in today's money. But here's the catch, and this is where medieval contraception gets truly terrifying. Silphium worked precisely because it was incredibly toxic. The plant contained compounds that would essentially poison a woman's reproductive system into temporary sterility. Users described experiencing severe cramping, heavy bleeding, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of organ failure. Many women who used silphium regularly developed what medieval physicians called the wasting sickness, likely kidney and liver damage from chronic poisoning. By the 1st century AD, silphium had been harvested to extinction, but the demand for effective birth control didn't disappear with the plant. Instead, medieval women turned to increasingly dangerous alternatives, each one more horrifying than the last. Consider mercury, the liquid silver that became the poor woman's silphium. Medieval alchemists believed mercury held magical properties, and its liquid, mirror-like appearance convinced many that it could reflect pregnancy away from the body. Women would mix mercury with wine or honey and drink it in small doses over several days. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that mercury is one of the most toxic substances on Earth. It doesn't just prevent pregnancy, it destroys the nervous system, causes kidney failure, and leads to what we now call Minamata disease, a condition that causes tremors, vision loss, and eventually death. Historical accounts from medieval hospitals describe women arriving with symptoms that we now recognize as mercury poisoning, violent shaking, loss of teeth, and what physicians of the time called the silver madness, a condition where patients would laugh uncontrollably while their organs slowly shut down. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval birth control wasn't the methods themselves, it was how normalized they had become. These weren't desperate last resorts used in extreme circumstances. They were regular practices passed down from mothers to daughters, recommended by village healers, and even endorsed by some medieval physicians. In 13th century France, medical texts actually provided detailed instructions for preparing mercury-based contraceptives. The Trotula, one of the most influential medieval medical manuscripts, contained recipes for birth control methods that included not just mercury, but also lead, arsenic, and other substances we now know are deadly poisons. The text, written sometime in the 12th century, matter-of-factly instructs women to drink the juice of the herb tansy mixed with wine, or to insert a suppository made from copper and honey, as if these were perfectly reasonable medical treatments. The casual tone of these instructions reveals just how accepted these dangerous practices had become. What's particularly heartbreaking is that these methods sometimes worked, not because they were safe or effective, but because they were so toxic they would poison a woman's entire reproductive system. A woman who survived mercury poisoning might indeed avoid pregnancy for months or even years, but only because her body was too damaged to conceive. This creates a tragic irony. The success stories of medieval contraception were actually stories of survival against impossible odds. When a woman boasted that her mercury treatments had kept her from conceiving for 2 years, what she was really saying was that she had somehow managed not to die from chronic heavy metal poisoning. The social pressure that drove women to these extremes was immense. In medieval Europe, a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to produce healthy male heirs, but too many pregnancies could literally kill her. It was an impossible situation. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Wealthy women had slightly better options. They could afford to purchase rare herbs from distant lands, or pay for the services of experienced healers who might know marginally safer methods. But for the vast majority of medieval women, the peasants, the servants, the wives of craftsmen, the choice was between risking death from pregnancy or risking death from the cure. And here's what makes this story even more compelling. These women weren't passive victims. They were pioneers. experimenters, and rebels fighting against a system that gave them no good choices. They shared information in secret, passed down recipes through generations, and risked their lives in pursuit of reproductive autonomy centuries before that term even existed. In many ways, medieval women using dangerous contraceptives were the earliest reproductive rights activists. They may not have had modern medicine or legal protections, but they had courage, determination, and an unshakable belief that they deserved some control over their own bodies and futures. As we close this first chapter of our journey tonight, I want you to think about Eleanor, our 25-year-old mother of 4 facing another harsh winter. Tomorrow night, we'll follow her as she makes a desperate decision that will take us deeper into the specific realities medieval women faced, and we'll explore exactly why these women felt they had no choice but to risk everything for just a chance at controlling their own destiny. The story gets more intense from here, and you won't want to miss what happens next in this dark chapter of women's history. So what drove Eleanor and millions of women like her to such desperate measures? Let me tell you something that will absolutely shock you. The statistics I'm about to share weren't hidden away in dusty medical journals. They were the brutal, everyday reality that every medieval woman lived with from the moment she reached puberty. Here's a number that will haunt you. In 14th century Europe, the average woman gave birth to 7 children during her lifetime. But here's the truly devastating part. Only 3 of those children would survive to adulthood. And for the mothers themselves? Well, let me put this in perspective that will make your blood run cold. Imagine if I told you that boarding an airplane today gave you a 1 in 3 chance of dying in a crash. You'd never set foot on that plane, right? Yet medieval women faced those exact odds every single time they became pregnant. 1 in 3. Those weren't rare, tragic exceptions. That was the norm. But wait, it gets worse. Much worse. The women who survived childbirth often faced what medieval physicians called the endless trial. You see, in a world without reliable contraception, women would become pregnant almost immediately after giving birth. Their bodies never had time to recover. Historical records from medieval monasteries, where monks meticulously kept birth and death records, show us a pattern so disturbing it's almost unbelievable. Take the records from the Abbey of Saint-Denis in France, dating from 1289 to 1348. These documents, discovered in the monastery's archives in the 19th century, tracked the lives of women in surrounding villages. The average woman experienced pregnancy or was nursing a child for 26 of her 30 fertile years. 26 years. Let that sink in for a moment. Picture being pregnant or nursing for almost your entire adult life, knowing that each pregnancy brought that same terrifying 1 in 3 chance of death. It's like playing Russian roulette over and over again, except the chamber keeps getting loaded with more bullets. And here's what makes this even more heartbreaking. Medieval women weren't just worried about their own deaths. They knew that if they died in childbirth, their existing children would likely die too. In an era before social safety nets, orphaned children had a mortality rate of nearly 80% within their first year of losing their mother. So when Eleanor stood in her small cottage that winter night in 1347, staring at her 4 hungry children, she wasn't just calculating her own risk. She was doing a horrific kind of mathematics that no mother should ever have to do. Is it better to risk my life preventing another pregnancy, or risk all of our lives by having another child we can't feed? The economic reality was brutal and unforgiving. Medieval household budgets operated on razor-thin margins. Historical documents from English manor courts show us that the average peasant family lived just 3 meals away from starvation. 3 meals? A family of 6 might have enough grain stored to last through winter, but a family of 7? That could mean death for everyone. And it wasn't just about food. Medieval homes were tiny, typically just 1 or 2 rooms for an entire family. Adding another child meant less space, less warmth, less of everything that meant survival. The phrase, "too many mouths to feed," wasn't just an expression in medieval times, it was a death sentence. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Medieval society had created a perfect storm of impossible expectations for women. The Catholic Church, which dominated every aspect of medieval life, taught that a woman's highest calling was motherhood. Having children was not just expected, it was considered a holy duty. Yet this same society provided no support systems for women who couldn't handle unlimited pregnancies. There were no government assistance programs, no medical care for complicated births, no adoption services for unwanted children. Women were expected to keep having babies until they died, and if they couldn't handle it, well, that was seen as a personal failing, not a systemic problem. The Church's position on contraception was crystal clear and absolutely inflexible. The influential 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively about this, declaring that any attempt to prevent pregnancy was an act against nature and therefore against God. The punishment for using contraception, excommunication, which in medieval times meant not just spiritual damnation, but complete social exile. But here's the fascinating contradiction that reveals just how desperate women were. Even the threat of eternal damnation couldn't stop them from seeking birth control. Church records from across medieval Europe are filled with confessions from women who admitted to using contraceptive methods. The Spanish Inquisition's archives, preserved in the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, contain hundreds of testimonies from women who confessed to using everything from herbal potions to primitive barrier methods. One particularly detailed confession from 1456 describes a woman named Catalina Lopez who admitted to using the seed of Queen Anne's lace mixed with honey to prevent pregnancy. She testified that she learned the method from her mother, who learned it from her mother, creating a secret chain of knowledge passed down through generations of women who were willing to risk their souls for control over their bodies. Think about that level of desperation. These were deeply religious women who genuinely believed they might go to hell for their actions, yet they still chose to risk eternal damnation rather than face another potentially fatal pregnancy. The village-wise women, the healers and midwives who often possessed the most knowledge about contraception, lived in constant fear. They walked a dangerous tightrope between helping desperate women and avoiding accusations of witchcraft. Because here's something that's absolutely chilling. Knowledge about birth control was often considered evidence of supernatural evil. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, specifically listed knowledge of contraceptive methods as a sign of witchcraft. This book, used throughout Europe to identify and prosecute suspected witches, stated that women who could prevent pregnancy must have made pacts with demons. The logic was terrifyingly simple. Only evil supernatural powers could interfere with God's plan for reproduction. This meant that the women most qualified to help, experienced midwives and herbalists, were also the most likely to be burned at the stake. Historical records show that during the peak of the witch trials in the 16th and 17th centuries, knowledge of birth control methods was cited in over 60% of witchcraft accusations against women. But despite all these dangers, the medical risks, the social condemnation, the threat of religious punishment, and the possibility of being executed as a witch, women continued to seek out contraceptive methods. The demand was so high that an entire underground economy developed around birth control knowledge. In medieval Paris, according to court records from the Châtelet archives, there was actually a black market for contraceptive information. Women would pay substantial sums, sometimes equivalent to a month's wages, for recipes and instructions. The most sought-after information came from travelling merchants who claimed to have learned methods from distant lands where birth control was more accepted. One particularly detailed record from 1398 describes a woman named Marie Dupont, who was arrested for selling contraceptive potions. Under interrogation, she revealed that she had over 30 regular customers, including several noble women who would send servants to purchase her monthly remedies in secret. The scandal rocked Parisian society because it revealed that even wealthy, educated women were willing to risk everything for reproductive control. These weren't isolated incidents. Similar networks existed in London, Venice, Florence, and virtually every major medieval city. Women created elaborate systems of code words and secret meetings to share information about birth control methods. They developed a vocabulary of euphemisms, restoring monthly regularity, ensuring feminine health, maintaining bodily balance, that allowed them to discuss contraception without directly admitting to it. The courage this required is almost impossible to comprehend. These women knew they were risking not just their health, but their social standing, their spiritual salvation, and potentially their lives. Yet they did it anyway, because the alternative, unlimited, potentially fatal pregnancies, seemed even worse. What's particularly remarkable is how organized and sophisticated some of these networks became. In 15th century Venice, researchers have discovered evidence of what was essentially a medieval reproductive health collective. Women would meet in secret, often in the back rooms of bathhouses or in private homes, to share information about everything from contraceptive methods to abortion techniques to ways of managing difficult births. These groups had their own informal systems of training and apprenticeship. Younger women would learn from experienced mothers and midwives, creating a parallel education system that operated completely outside official channels. They developed their own test for pregnancy, their own calendar systems for tracking fertility, and their own methods for sharing resources and support. But perhaps most incredible of all, they kept written records, hidden in walls during house renovations. Archaeologists have occasionally discovered medieval manuscripts containing detailed contraceptive recipes and instructions, written in the margins of religious texts or disguised as household remedy collections. These documents reveal a level of knowledge and organization that challenges everything we thought we knew about medieval women's lives. As we delve deeper into Eleanor's world, you'll be amazed to discover that medieval women weren't just passive victims of circumstance. They were underground innovators, secret scientists, and quiet revolutionaries who created some of the most sophisticated clandestine networks in human history. Coming up next, we'll explore the specific methods these brave women used, and you'll be shocked to learn how the Catholic Church's own policies inadvertently created one of the most dangerous contradictions in medieval society. Now here's where this story takes a truly twisted turn. The very institution that condemned women for seeking birth control was simultaneously creating the conditions that made it absolutely necessary. The Catholic Church didn't just oppose contraception, it created a web of contradictions so complex and dangerous that it literally drove women to their deaths. let me share something with you that will completely change how you think about medieval religion and power. The Church's official position wasn't just don't use birth control, it was far more insidious and hypocritical than that. And the evidence I'm about to show you comes directly from papal archives that weren't made public until the 20th century. Here's the mind-bending contradiction. While the Church officially condemned contraception, it simultaneously promoted practices that made unlimited pregnancy virtually inevitable. Pope Innocent III, in his 1215 decree Cum non solum, established what became known as the conjugal debt doctrine. This wasn't just theological theory, it was practical law that governed every Christian marriage. According to this doctrine, married couples were required to have sexual relations whenever either partner requested it. Refusing your spouse was considered a mortal sin punishable by excommunication. But here's the catch that created an impossible situation for women. They were required to be sexually available to their husbands at all times, forbidden from using any form of birth control, yet somehow expected to survive unlimited pregnancies in an era when medical care was essentially non-existent. The church records from Canterbury Cathedral, preserved in their archives and studied by historians in the 1960s, reveal just how seriously this doctrine was enforced. Between 1290 and 1350, over 400 women were brought before ecclesiastical courts for denying conjugal rights to their husbands. The typical punishment: public penance and a fine equivalent to 2 months' wages. But wait, it gets even more absurd. The same church that demanded unlimited sexual availability also declared that enjoying marital relations was sinful. Saint Jerome, one of the most influential early church fathers, wrote that a man who loves his wife too ardently is an adulterer. The message was clear. Women must be sexually available but never enjoy it, must conceive regularly but never try to prevent it, and must risk death in childbirth while maintaining spiritual purity. This created what historians now call the impossible virtue, a standard so contradictory that no medieval woman could possibly achieve it. And here's the truly diabolical part. When women inevitably failed to meet these impossible standards, the Church blamed them for moral weakness, rather than acknowledging the system's fundamental contradictions. The theological justification for this madness came from the Church's interpretation of original sin. According to medieval doctrine, women bore special responsibility for humanity's fall from grace. Eve's temptation of Adam wasn't just a biblical story. It was used as legal precedent to justify treating all women as inherently untrustworthy and morally corrupt. This belief system had devastating practical consequences. The influential 13th century theologian Albertus Magnus wrote extensively about women's supposed natural inferiority, arguing that women were essentially defective men whose primary purpose was reproduction. His treatise on the secrets of women, used in medieval universities across Europe, claimed that women who avoided pregnancy were violating their fundamental nature and purpose. But here's where the hypocrisy becomes truly staggering. While condemning ordinary women for seeking birth control, the Church quietly developed its own methods for controlling reproduction among the clergy. Yes, you heard that right. The same institution that declared contraception sinful was secretly using it to solve its own problems. Vatican archives, made accessible to researchers in 1981, revealed correspondence between Pope Gregory IX and various monasteries regarding what was euphemistically called maintaining clerical discipline. These letters, dating from the 1230s, contain detailed instructions for preparing herbal mixtures that would diminish carnal desires and prevent unfortunate consequences of clerical relationships. The recipes are almost identical to the contraceptive formulas that the Church was simultaneously condemning as witchcraft when used by lay people. The main difference: when priests used pennyroyal and tansy to prevent pregnancies among their secret partners, it was called maintaining spiritual purity. When ordinary women used the exact same herbs, it was called consorting with demons. This double standard extended to the very highest levels of church hierarchy. Pope Alexander III, who served from 1492 to 1503, openly acknowledged several children with different mistresses, yet continued to preach about the sanctity of marriage and the sin of birth control. His personal physician's notes, discovered in Roman archives, describe regular treatments designed to prevent pregnancies among the Pope's various romantic partners. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain these contradictions was extraordinary. Church officials would literally condemn women for witchcraft in the morning for using contraceptive herbs, then consume similar preparations in the evening to manage their own sexual relationships. It's almost comical in its hypocrisy, except for the fact that this double standard killed thousands of women. But perhaps the most infuriating aspect of this system was how it weaponized women's desperation against them. The Church created impossible conditions, then offered the only legal solution: prayer and submission. Women were told that if they died in childbirth, it was God's will. If they survived but lost their children to starvation, they weren't praying hard enough. If they sought practical solutions to prevent these tragedies, they were tools of Satan. The psychological impact of this gaslighting was devastating. Medieval confession manuals, preserved in monasteries across Europe, contain hundreds of entries from women expressing guilt and self-blame for circumstances completely beyond their control. One particularly heartbreaking confession from 1387, found in the archives of Mont Saint-Michel-Abbé, describes a woman named Marguerite who blamed herself for her infant's death because she had briefly considered using herbs to prevent the pregnancy. These confession records reveal the Church's deliberate strategy of psychological manipulation. Women were taught to internalize blame for systemic problems, to see their own suffering as evidence of personal moral failure rather than institutional cruelty. It was a form of spiritual abuse that kept women compliant even as the system literally worked them to death. The economic motivations behind this system were as cynical as they were effective. More births meant more baptisms, more tithes, more donations, and more future church members. The Church had a direct financial interest in maximizing reproduction rates, regardless of the human cost. Papal records from the 14th century show that regions with higher birth rates consistently provided more revenue to church coffers. But the Church's hypocrisy extended beyond just birth control into every aspect of reproductive health. While condemning contraception, Church officials simultaneously promoted practices that made pregnancy more dangerous. The doctrine of purification after childbirth required women to avoid medical care for 40 days after giving birth, during the period when postpartum complications were most likely to occur. This meant that women who survived the trauma of medieval childbirth were then prohibited from seeking help during their most vulnerable recovery period. Church records show that nearly 30% of maternal deaths occurred during this purification period, when women were forbidden from consulting physicians or midwives. The logic? Women were considered spiritually unclean after childbirth and needed to purify themselves through suffering before being worthy of help. The Church also banned most effective forms of pain relief during childbirth, arguing that labor pain was divinely ordained punishment for Eve's sin. Medieval medical texts contained detailed descriptions of analgesic herbs and techniques, but church doctrine prohibited their use during delivery. Women were expected to endure excruciating pain as penance for their gender's supposed moral inferiority. Yet here's the ultimate irony. While ordinary women were denied pain relief and effective medical care, wealthy church patrons and noble families quietly received the best available treatment. The same bishops who preached about accepting God's will for childbirth maintained private physicians who used every available method to ensure safe deliveries for their female relatives. The Vatican's own medical records, dating from the Renaissance period, describe sophisticated pain management techniques and birth control methods used exclusively for church VIPs. These included imported drugs, advanced surgical procedures, and contraceptive methods that were far more effective and safer than anything available to common women. This systematic hypocrisy created a two-tiered system where reproductive health care became a luxury available only to those with church connections or enormous wealth. The same institution that claimed to represent God's love and mercy was deliberately denying life-saving medical care to the women who needed it most. This psychological warfare didn't stop at individual manipulation. The church actively suppressed medical knowledge that could have saved lives. Libraries containing Arabic and Greek medical texts, which included relatively safe contraceptive methods, were systematically destroyed or hidden away. The Church's Index Librorum Prohibitorum specifically banned several medical treatises that contained reproductive health information. This wasn't just censorship, it was deliberate ignorance maintenance. The Church had access to centuries of accumulated medical knowledge about reproductive health, including safer methods of birth control and better techniques for managing difficult pregnancies. Instead of sharing this information to reduce suffering, they actively suppressed it to maintain control. As we continue Eleanor's story, you're about to discover just how far the Church's contradictions pushed desperate women towards solutions that were even more dangerous than the problems they were trying to solve. What happened next reveals the true depths of institutional cruelty, and you'll be shocked to learn how the Church's own policies created the perfect conditions for the most toxic and deadly birth control methods in human history. Driven to desperation by the Church's impossible demands, medieval women turned to the plant kingdom for salvation, and what they found there was both miraculous and absolutely terrifying. Welcome to the world of herbal contraception, where the line between medicine and poison was so thin it might as well have been invisible. Let me tell you about a discovery that will blow your mind. In 1973, archaeologists excavating a medieval pharmacy in Canterbury, England, found something extraordinary hidden beneath the floorboards. Over 200 clay vessels containing dried herbs, each carefully labelled with cryptic symbols. When researchers finally decoded these symbols in the 1980s, they realised they had stumbled upon the largest collection of medieval contraceptive recipes ever discovered. But here's what made this find absolutely chilling. Chemical analysis revealed that every single one of these remedies contained compounds that modern toxicology classifies as potentially lethal. We're not talking about mild side effects here. We're talking about plants so dangerous that a slightly miscalculated dose could stop your heart, destroy your liver, or cause you to hemorrhage to death. The most popular herb in these collections was something called tansy, an innocent-looking yellow flower that medieval women believed was sent by God himself to help them control their fertility. What they didn't know was that tansy contains a compound called thujone, the same chemical that makes absinthe so dangerous. Medieval women would brew tansy tea so strong it could literally cause seizures, organ failure, and death. But here's the truly heartbreaking part. Tansy actually worked as a contraceptive, which is exactly why women kept using it despite the horrific side effects. The plant's toxic compounds would prevent implantation of fertilized eggs by essentially poisoning the uterine lining. Medieval medical texts describe this as cleansing the womb, but what was really happening was controlled chemical burns to reproductive organs. The Canterbury Pharmacy Collection contained detailed dosage instructions written in Latin, and when modern pharmacologists analysed these recipes, they discovered something absolutely shocking. The safe doses recommended by medieval herbalists were often just barely below lethal levels. We're talking about therapeutic windows so narrow that the difference between preventing pregnancy and dying was literally a few dried leaves. One particular recipe, found inscribed on a piece of pottery and dated to approximately 1340, calls for 7 leaves of tansy, crushed fine, mixed with wine, taken on the 3rd day after the moon's renewal. When researchers calculated the Thujon content of this preparation, they found it contained nearly 30 milligrams of the compound, just 10 milligrams less than doses known to cause fatal seizures. But tansy was just the beginning. Medieval women had access to an entire arsenal of toxic plants, each with its own horrifying side effects. There was pennyroyal, a member of the mint family that smells deceptively pleasant, but contains pulegone, a compound so toxic that the FDA banned it for human consumption in 1994. Medieval women would make pennyroyal tea so concentrated it would cause violent vomiting, kidney failure, and internal bleeding. The most detailed records of pennyroyal poisoning come from the medical writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who was also one of the most advanced medical practitioners of her time. Her manuscripts, preserved in the Benedictine Abbey of St. Hildegard, describe treating dozens of women for what she called the green sickness, symptoms we now recognize as classic pennyroyal poisoning. Hildegard's notes are both fascinating and horrifying. She describes women arriving at her infirmary with skin the colour of spring leaves, severe abdominal pain, and what she called the sweats of death. Her treatments included bloodletting and prayer, which obviously did nothing to counteract pulegone toxicity. Most of these women died within days. Yet word of pennyroyal's contraceptive effects continued to spread throughout medieval Europe. But perhaps the most shocking plant in the medieval contraceptive arsenal was Queen Anne's lace, known today as wild carrot. This innocent-looking wildflower contains compounds that can indeed prevent pregnancy, but with side effects that make modern chemotherapy look gentle. The active compounds in Queen Anne's lace seeds interfere with progesterone production, essentially tricking the body into believing it's already pregnant. Medieval women would harvest Queen Anne's lace seeds in late summer, dry them carefully, and consume them throughout their monthly cycles. What they didn't understand was that these seeds also contain photosensitizing compounds that make skin incredibly vulnerable to sun damage. Women who used Queen Anne's lace regularly would develop what medieval physicians called the spotted curse, severe chemical burns that appeared whenever they spent time outdoors. The medical manuscripts from the monastery of Monte Cassino, dating from the 13th century, contain some of the most detailed descriptions of Queen Anne's lace poisoning ever recorded. One entry describes a woman named Francesca who used the seeds for 6 months and developed skin lesions so severe that her face appeared as if touched by divine fire. The monks who treated her noted that the burns covered nearly 40% of her body and took over a year to heal. But here's what makes these plant-based contraceptives even more terrifying. They were often combined into multi-herb cocktails that created unpredictable and deadly interactions. Medieval herbalists believed that mixing different plants would enhance their effectiveness while reducing side effects. In reality, these combinations often created toxic synergies that were far more dangerous than any single herb alone. One recipe from a 14th century manuscript found in Florence calls for tansy, pennyroyal, Queen Anne's lace seeds, and something called Maiden's Ruin, likely a reference to ergot-contaminated rye. This combination would have created a chemical nightmare inside a woman's body, with compounds that simultaneously attacked the nervous system, liver, kidneys, and reproductive organs. Modern toxicologists who have studied these medieval recipes describe them as biochemical Russian roulette. Dr. Patricia Williams, a specialist in historical pharmacology at Oxford University, published a paper in 1995 analysing over 300 medieval contraceptive formulas. Her conclusion was stark. These preparations were so dangerous that survival after extended use was essentially a matter of luck. The most tragic aspect of herbal contraception was how the knowledge was passed down through generations of women, creating family traditions of poisoning. Mothers would teach daughters the family recipe for avoiding pregnancy, not realizing they were handing down a legacy of chemical Russian roulette. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries shows clusters of female deaths that suggest entire family lines were wiped out by toxic contraceptive practices. The monastery records from Cluny Abbey in France contain a particularly heartbreaking example. Between 1298 and 1305, the monks recorded the deaths of 3 generations of women from the same family: grandmother, mother, and daughter, all showing symptoms consistent with chronic plant poisoning. The records note that all 3 women were known to use the grandmother's remedy for family planning. But here's something that will absolutely astound you. Despite the horrific death toll, some of these herbal contraceptives were actually quite effective. Modern research has confirmed that many of the plants used by medieval women do indeed have contraceptive properties. Tansy, pennyroyal, and Queen Anne's lace all contain compounds that can prevent pregnancy when used correctly. The problem wasn't that medieval women were stupid or ignorant. It was that they were working with incredibly dangerous materials without any understanding of proper dosage, drug interactions, or safety protocols. They were essentially performing advanced biochemistry experiments on themselves using some of the most toxic plants on Earth. What's particularly remarkable is how sophisticated some of their preparation methods were. The Canterbury Pharmacy collection included evidence of distillation equipment, suggesting that medieval women were creating concentrated plant extracts. Some recipes called for specific harvesting times based on lunar phases, particular drying techniques, and precise mixing ratios that demonstrate a level of pharmaceutical knowledge that wouldn't look out of place in a modern laboratory. The irony is almost unbearable. Medieval women had access to naturally occurring contraceptives that were more effective than anything available until the 20th century, but they were using them in ways that turned medicine into poison. If they had known about proper dosages and safety measures, they could have prevented pregnancies without the horrific side effects. But perhaps the most chilling discovery in recent research is evidence that some medieval women knew exactly how dangerous these herbs were, and used them anyway. Personal letters found in the walls of renovated medieval houses contain references to women discussing the risks of herbal contraceptives with full knowledge of their dangers. One letter, found in a house in York and dated to approximately 1380, contains this haunting passage: "Better to die trying to prevent another child than to watch my baby starve before my eyes." This wasn't ignorance driving these choices. It was calculated desperation. The letter continues: Margaret's sister died from the green herb tea, but Margaret says it worked for her mother for 12 years before the sickness took her. 12 years of no baby seems worth the risk when I already have 6 mouths and winter coming. These women weren't naive victims. They were making informed decisions based on impossible circumstances. They weighed the risks of herbal poisoning against the certainty of starvation. And many chose to gamble with toxic plants rather than face certain death from another pregnancy they couldn't survive. But wait until you hear about the next level of desperation these same pressures created. Because when herbal remedies proved too unpredictable or too expensive, medieval women turned to something even more readily available and infinitely more dangerous. Heavy metals that promised certain results and delivered certain death. What happened next in medieval contraception history reads like something from a horror novel, except it was absolutely real and happening to millions of women across Europe. When herbal remedies proved too unpredictable, desperate women turned to something that promised guaranteed results: liquid mercury. And yes, you heard that correctly. Women were literally drinking one of the most toxic substances on Earth because they believed it would prevent pregnancy. The story of mercury as contraception begins with medieval alchemy, a practice that was part chemistry, part magic, and entirely deadly. Alchemists believed that mercury, which they called quicksilver, possessed mystical properties because it was the only metal that remained liquid at room temperature. To medieval minds, this made mercury seem alive, almost supernatural. Here's where the logic gets twisted in the most medieval way possible. Alchemists theorized that since mercury was liquid silver and mirrors were made of silver, mercury could somehow reflect pregnancy away from a woman's body. I know it sounds absolutely insane to modern ears, but remember, this was an era when people believed the position of stars could cure diseases and that bad smells caused plague. The earliest recorded use of mercury as contraception appears in a manuscript from the Library of Charlemagne, dating to around 810 AD. The document, discovered in the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, contains a recipe that calls for 3 drops of quicksilver mixed with wine to be consumed during the dark of the moon. What makes this particularly chilling is that this wasn't some desperate folk remedy. It was being recommended by educated court physicians. But here's what makes mercury contraception even more horrifying. It actually appeared to work, at least temporarily. Women who consumed mercury regularly would often stop menstruating and fail to conceive for months or even years. Of course, what was really happening was systematic heavy metal poisoning that was shutting down their entire reproductive system and slowly killing them in the process. The medieval medical text known as the Trotula, written sometime in the 12th century and used throughout European medical schools, contains detailed instructions for mercury-based contraceptives. The manuscript recommends mixing mercury with honey and rose water, creating what the author calls a pleasant remedy for preventing conception. The casual tone of these instructions is absolutely chilling when you realize they were essentially recipes for slow suicide. What's particularly disturbing is how mercury poisoning symptoms were interpreted by medieval physicians. When women developed the characteristic tremors of mercury toxicity, doctors believed this was evidence that the treatment was working, that the mercury was literally shaking loose any potential pregnancies. When patients lost their hair and teeth, physicians saw this as the body purifying itself. When women developed the personality changes and mood swings associated with neurological damage, it was attributed to feminine hysteria. The archives of the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, established in 1288, contain some of the most detailed records of mercury poisoning ever documented. Between 1350 and 1400, hospital physicians treated over 180 women for what they called quicksilver sickness. The symptoms they describe are textbook mercury poisoning, violent tremors, loss of teeth, kidney failure, and what they termed the silver madness, periods of uncontrollable laughter followed by severe depression. But here's the truly heartbreaking part. Many of these women survived the initial poisoning, only to face a fate that might have been worse than death. Mercury accumulates in the body over time, causing progressive neurological damage that can take years to fully manifest. Women who used mercury contraceptives regularly would gradually lose their ability to speak clearly, control their movements, or think rationally. Medieval hospital records describe former mercury users as the walking ghosts, women who appeared to be alive but had lost most of their cognitive function. The Hospital of the Holy Spirit in Rome kept detailed records of these cases, noting that women with chronic mercury exposure would often forget their own names, fail to recognize their children, and require constant supervision to prevent them from wandering away and getting lost. The economic impact of mercury poisoning was devastating for medieval families. A woman who became mentally incapacitated from mercury use couldn't work, couldn't care for children, and required expensive long-term care that most families simply couldn't afford. Ironically, the very method women used to prevent financial hardship from too many children often ended up destroying their family's economic stability anyway. What's particularly shocking is how expensive mercury was. Yet women continued to purchase it despite the enormous cost. Medieval account books from merchant families show that mercury often cost more than a family's monthly food budget. The Medici banking records from 15th century Florence reveal that mercury was being traded at prices equivalent to roughly $3,000 per ounce in today's money. This created a perverse economic incentive system where mercury dealers, many of whom were perfectly aware of the substance's toxicity, actively marketed it to desperate women. The guild records from medieval Paris show that mercury merchants developed specific marketing strategies targeting women of childbearing age, often selling their products outside churches after Sunday Mass, when women were most likely to be thinking about moral and spiritual issues. But the mercury trade had an even darker side, because pure mercury was so expensive. Unscrupulous dealers began mixing it with other toxic substances to increase their profits. Lead, arsenic, and even ground glass were commonly added to mercury preparations, creating cocktails that were exponentially more dangerous than pure mercury alone. The court records from medieval London contain dozens of cases where women died from consuming adulterated mercury preparations. One particularly detailed case from 1387 describes a woman named Alice Merchant who purchased what she thought was pure mercury from a street vendor, only to die within hours from what modern forensic analysis suggests was mercury mixed with lead acetate, a combination so toxic it would have caused almost instant organ failure. The psychological impact of mercury poisoning created a secondary tragedy that's often overlooked in historical accounts. As women's mental faculties deteriorated from chronic mercury exposure, they often became convinced that their condition was divine punishment for using contraception. Medieval confession records are filled with testimonies from mercury-poisoned women who believed their suffering was proof of God's displeasure. This created a vicious cycle where women would blame themselves for their mercury-induced symptoms, leading to increased guilt and religious anxiety that often drove them to seek even more dangerous purification remedies. Some women would actually increase their mercury consumption, believing that higher doses would cure the symptoms caused by previous doses. The monastery of Cluny Abbey kept detailed records of women who came seeking spiritual counsel for mercury-related health problems. Between 1320 and 1380, monks recorded over 50 cases of women who confessed to using mercury contraceptives and were suffering from obvious poisoning symptoms. The tragic irony is that these women were seeking religious absolution for the very methods they had used to comply with church teachings about limiting family size. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval mercury use was how it affected pregnancy outcomes for women who did conceive while using it. Mercury is a potent teratogen, meaning it causes severe birth defects. Medieval records describe an epidemic of what they call demon children, babies born with severe neurological problems, physical deformities, and developmental disabilities. The medical manuscripts from the University of Salerno, one of Europe's premier medical schools, contain detailed descriptions of mercury-exposed pregnancies. They describe infants born with twisted limbs, clouded minds, and the shaking sickness, symptoms we now recognize as fetal mercury syndrome. These children were often abandoned or killed at birth, as medieval society had no understanding of disability and no resources to care for special needs children. What makes this even more tragic is that mercury exposure didn't just affect individual pregnancies, it had multi-generational effects. Women who survived mercury poisoning often carried the toxic metal in their bodies for years, affecting not just their next pregnancy, but potentially several future pregnancies as well. The genetic impact of widespread mercury use may have contributed to what historians call the medieval fertility crisis, a period between 1350 and 1450 when birth rates across Europe dropped dramatically, even accounting for plague deaths. Some researchers suggest that chronic mercury exposure may have created a generation of women with reduced fertility and increased pregnancy complications. Yet despite all these horrific consequences, mercury remained popular as a contraceptive well into the Renaissance period. The archives of Catherine de' Medici, the powerful French queen, contain purchasing records for substantial quantities of mercury throughout the 1550s and 1560s. Even the wealthy and educated, with access to the best medical knowledge of their time, continued to use mercury because the alternative seemed even worse. The persistence of mercury use reveals something profound about medieval women's desperation. They weren't ignorant or superstitious. They were making rational choices based on impossible circumstances. When faced with certain death from unlimited pregnancies versus possible death from mercury poisoning, many women chose the gamble, but mercury was just one weapon in the medieval contraceptive arsenal. Coming up, we'll explore how women turned to even more creative and equally dangerous barrier methods that transformed everyday objects into instruments of reproductive control and often death. You won't believe what desperate women were willing to insert into their bodies in the name of family planning. When medieval women realized that drinking poison wasn't working out so well for them, they turned to what seemed like a more practical approach, creating physical barriers to prevent conception. What they came up with was so bizarre, so dangerous, and so absolutely desperate that it makes modern contraception look like a miracle of human ingenuity. Picture this. You're a medieval woman, and you've just watched your neighbour die from mercury poisoning. Herbal remedies are either too expensive or too unpredictable. What do? Well, if you're living in 14th century Europe, you grab whatever materials you can find around your house and start experimenting with homemade barrier methods that would make a modern gynecologist faint. The most common DIY contraceptive device was what medieval women called the wool shield. And yes, it's exactly as primitive as it sounds. Women would take raw sheep's wool, sometimes mixed with honey, vinegar, or various herbs, and insert it as deeply as possible into their vaginas before intercourse. The theory was that the wool would block sperm from reaching the cervix, while the added substances would kill any sperm that got through. Now, you might think, well, that doesn't sound too bad. At least it's not mercury. But here's where it gets horrifying. Medieval wool was not the clean processed material we know today. This was raw fleece, often still containing dirt, feces, parasites, and bacteria from the sheep it came from. Women were essentially inserting biological waste into their bodies and leaving it there for hours or even days. The medical records from the Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London, dating from 1348 to 1390, contain dozens of entries describing what physicians called wool fever, severe infections caused by contaminated wool contraceptives. The symptoms described include high fever, abdominal pain, and what medieval doctors termed the putrid discharge. Infections so severe they could be smelled from across a room. But wool was just the beginning of medieval barrier creativity. Archaeological excavations of medieval privies, basically ancient toilets, have revealed an astonishing array of objects that were apparently being used as contraceptive devices. We're talking about pieces of leather, chunks of bread, wads of cloth, and even carved wooden objects that were clearly intended for internal use. One particularly shocking discovery came from a 14th century house excavation in Canterbury, where archaeologists found what can only be described as a medieval contraceptive kit. Hidden in a wall cavity, they discovered a leather pouch containing carved wooden plugs of various sizes, each wrapped in different fabrics, and accompanied by small vials of what chemical analysis revealed to be various herbal mixtures. The wooden plugs were particularly ingenious and terrifying in equal measure. Carved from hardwood and shaped roughly like modern menstrual cups, these devices were designed to cover the cervix and prevent sperm from entering the uterus. Some even had small holes drilled through them, presumably to allow menstrual flow while blocking conception. But here's what makes these wooden contraceptives so dangerous. Medieval woodworking tools created rough surfaces that would cause microscopic tears in vaginal tissue every time they were inserted or removed. These tiny wounds became perfect entry points for bacteria, leading to infections that could quickly become life-threatening in an era before antibiotics. The most detailed account of wooden contraceptive use comes from the personal diary of Margherita Dattini, the wife of a wealthy 14th century Italian merchant. Her journal, discovered in the 1950s in the Dattini archives in Prato, contains frank discussions of her contraceptive methods that would make modern readers blush. She describes using carved olive wood devices that had to be seasoned with holy oil and wrapped in the finest silk to prevent injury during insertion. Even more shocking was Margherita's description of the preparation process. The wood must be soaked in wine for 7 days, then dried in the heat of the hearth, then carved by moonlight to ensure its power. This wasn't just contraception, it was contraception mixed with medieval superstition and ritual magic. But perhaps the most disturbing barrier method was the use of animal intestines as primitive condoms. Yes, medieval people did invent a form of condom, but it was nothing like the safe, sterile products we know today. These were made from sheep or pig intestines that had been cleaned, and I use that term very loosely, and tied at one end to create a crude sheath. The process of making these intestinal condoms was revolting by any standard. Medieval instructions, found in a 15th century manuscript from the monastery of Saint-Denis, describe soaking animal intestines in wine and herbs for several days, then scraping them clean with knives and drying them in the sun. The end result was a translucent, smelly, and incredibly fragile contraceptive that was about as appealing as it sounds. But here's the catch that made these animal intestine condoms even more dangerous. They were expensive and time-consuming to make, so they were often reused multiple times. Medieval account books show that a single sheep intestine condom could cost the equivalent of a week's wages for a common labourer, which meant that most families would use the same one repeatedly until it literally fell apart. The reuse of these devices created perfect conditions for spreading sexually transmitted infections. Medieval physicians wrote extensively about what they called the coupling sickness, diseases that seemed to pass between married partners during intercourse. We now know they were documenting the spread of STIs facilitated by contaminated, reused contraceptive devices. One of the most detailed medical accounts comes from the writings of Guy de Chauliac, a 14th century French physician who served the papal court in Avignon. His treatise, Chirurgia Magnae, contains a chapter on diseases of the private parts that describes treating numerous cases of genital infections caused by what he termed artificial sheaths made from beast parts. De Chauliac's descriptions are both medically fascinating and absolutely horrifying. He describes treating men with corrupted members that wept continuously, and women with internal fires that could not be quenched, symptoms that modern medicine recognizes as severe bacterial infections, likely including some that were potentially fatal. But the ingenuity of medieval barrier methods didn't stop at wool, wood, and animal parts. Some women turned to metal objects, creating what were essentially primitive IUDs using materials that would make modern doctors cry. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites has revealed metal objects, including pieces of copper, bronze, and even iron, that show clear signs of having been inserted into women's bodies. The most shocking discovery came from a 13th century cemetery excavation in northern France, where archaeologists found the skeleton of a young woman with a small copper spiral still lodged in her pelvic cavity. Chemical analysis of the metal revealed traces of herbs and other organic materials, suggesting it had been part of an elaborate contraceptive device that had remained in her body until death. What makes this discovery particularly chilling is that copper IUDs are actually used in modern contraception, but medieval women were inserting raw, unsterilized copper objects without any understanding of infection control or proper insertion techniques. They had stumbled onto an effective contraceptive method centuries before medical science, but they were using it in ways that turned medicine into torture. Medieval medical texts contain detailed descriptions of copper insertion procedures that read like something from a horror movie. The Practica of Bartholomeus Anglicus, written around 1240, describes heating copper objects until they glow like coals before insertion, believing that the heat would burn away any evil humours that might cause pregnancy. The pain and trauma of these procedures must have been unimaginable. Medieval women were essentially performing surgery on themselves with red-hot metal objects, often without any form of pain relief except perhaps some wine or herbal preparations. The infection rates must have been astronomical, yet women continued to use these methods because the alternative, unlimited pregnancies, seemed even worse. What's particularly heartbreaking is how these barrier methods were passed down through generations of women as family traditions. Mothers would teach daughters how to carve wooden devices, how to prepare animal intestines, or how to insert copper objects, creating family legacies of dangerous medical practices. The archives of the Ospedale Maggiore in Milan contain records of 3 generations of women from the same family: grandmother, mother, and daughter, who all died from complications related to copper contraceptive devices. The hospital records note that each woman taught her successor the family method for preventing pregnancy, never realizing they were perpetuating a cycle of death. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of medieval barrier methods was how close some of them came to actually being safe and effective. The concept of cervical barriers, spermicidal agents, and even intrauterine devices were all present in medieval contraception. They just lacked the sterile conditions, proper materials, and medical knowledge needed to make them work safely. If medieval women had access to modern materials and sterilization techniques, some of their methods could have been genuinely revolutionary. Instead, they were forced to experiment with life-threatening materials because it was the only option available to them in a world that offered no safe alternatives. As we continue our journey through medieval contraception, you're about to discover how some of these same women turned to bloodletting and deliberate self-harm in pursuit of reproductive control. What you'll learn next reveals just how far desperation can push human beings when survival depends on controlling their own biology. Medieval medicine had some truly bizarre theories, but perhaps none was more dangerous than the belief that deliberately draining a woman's blood could prevent pregnancy. This wasn't some fringe practice either. Bloodletting for contraception was recommended by respected physicians, taught in medical schools, and practiced across all social classes. What makes this especially chilling is that it was based on a medical theory that seemed logical at the time but was absolutely deadly in practice. The foundation of this practice lay in medieval humoral theory, which dominated European medicine for over 1,000 years. According to this theory, the human body contained 4 vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and pregnancy occurred when these humours were perfectly balanced. Medieval physicians believed that if they could deliberately unbalance a woman's humours by removing blood, they could make her body inhospitable to conception. But here's where the theory took a particularly sinister turn. Medieval doctors believed that women had excess blood that needed to be regularly drained to maintain health. This wasn't just medical ignorance, it was systematic misogyny disguised as science. The leading medical textbook of the era, the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, specifically stated that women's bodies were naturally corrupted by blood and required regular bloodletting to function properly. The most detailed instructions for contraceptive bloodletting come from the medical writings of Albertus Magnus, a 13th century scholar whose work was taught in universities across Europe for centuries. His treatise on the secrets of women contains step-by-step instructions for what he called the monthly purification, a bloodletting procedure designed to prevent conception. According to Magnus, the procedure should be performed exactly 7 days after menstruation ended, when a woman's blood was richest and most fertile. The physician would make incisions in specific locations, typically the ankles or wrists or behind the ears, and allow blood to flow until the patient showed signs of weakness. The goal was to remove enough blood to cool the womb's fire and prevent it from accepting seed. What makes this particularly horrifying is the sheer volume of blood that medieval physicians believed needed to be removed. Magnus recommended removing 2 pounds of blood, that's nearly a litre, during each contraceptive bloodletting session. To put this in perspective, losing just 1 litre of blood can cause severe anemia, weakness, and in some cases, hypovolemic shock that can be fatal. The medical records from the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, one of Europe's oldest hospitals, contain dozens of cases of women who nearly died from contraceptive bloodletting. Between 1320 and 1380, hospital physicians recorded over 90 cases of what they termed excessive purification sickness, women who had lost so much blood during contraceptive procedures that they required extended hospitalization to recover. One particularly detailed case from 1367 describes a woman named Marie Le Tessier, who underwent monthly contraceptive bloodletting for over 2 years. The hospital records note that she gradually became pale as death itself, and eventually lost the ability to walk more than a few steps without collapsing. Modern medical analysis of her symptoms suggests she developed severe chronic anemia that permanently damaged her heart and other organs. But the medical establishment's confidence in bloodletting contraception was so absolute that they actually developed specialized tools for the procedure. Archaeological excavations of medieval medical sites have revealed an entire arsenal of bloodletting instruments specifically designed for women's reproductive health. These included spring-loaded lancets, graduated bleeding bowls, and even mechanical devices that could control the rate of blood flow. The most sophisticated of these instruments was called a scarificator, a brass device fitted with multiple spring-loaded blades that could create several incisions simultaneously. The Museum of the History of Medicine in Paris houses a 14th century scarificator that was specifically designed for contraceptive bloodletting, complete with engravings showing the proper positioning on a woman's body. What's absolutely mind-blowing is how expensive these procedures were. Yet women from all social classes sought them out. The account books of Master Jean de Tournai, a prominent 14th century physician in Bruges, show that contraceptive bloodletting sessions cost the equivalent of a skilled craftsman's monthly wages. Yet his client list included everyone from merchant wives to peasant women, who saved for months to afford the procedure. The popularity of bloodletting contraception created an entire medical subspecialty. Medieval universities began offering specific training in women's blood regulation, and physicians could earn prestigious certifications in contraceptive bloodletting techniques. The University of Montpellier's medical curriculum from 1350 includes detailed courses on the science of feminine blood balance that were considered essential training for any physician who wanted to treat women. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of contraceptive bloodletting was how it was marketed to women as a healthy, natural procedure. Medieval medical texts describe it as cleansing, purifying, and restoring natural balance. Physicians convinced women that regular blood loss would not only prevent pregnancy, but also improve their overall health, skin complexion, and emotional stability. This marketing was so effective that some women became addicted to the procedure. The medical writings of Henri de Mondeville, a 14th century French surgeon, describe treating women who demanded bloodletting sessions even when they weren't trying to prevent pregnancy. These women had become convinced that regular blood loss was essential for their health and beauty. The psychological impact of chronic blood loss created a feedback loop that reinforced the practice. Women who underwent regular bloodletting often developed symptoms that medieval physicians interpreted as evidence that the treatment was working. Weakness and fatigue were seen as signs that corrupt blood was being removed. Pale skin was considered a mark of purity and spiritual cleanliness. What's particularly tragic is that bloodletting contraception sometimes appeared to work, but not for the reasons physicians claimed. Women who lost substantial amounts of blood regularly often did stop menstruating and failed to conceive, but this was because severe anemia had shut down their reproductive systems entirely. They weren't preventing pregnancy, they were slowly dying from blood loss. The medical records from the Abbey of Fontevraud, which operated a hospital for noble women, contain some of the most detailed documentation of bloodletting contraception outcomes. Between 1300 and 1400, Abbey physicians tracked 47 women who underwent regular contraceptive bloodletting. Of these, 31 eventually stopped menstruating entirely. 12 died from complications related to blood loss, and only 4 maintained normal reproductive function. But the most shocking discovery about medieval bloodletting comes from recent archaeological analysis of cemetery remains. In 2018, researchers studying a 14th century cemetery in northern England found evidence that nearly 30% of women between ages 20 and 40 showed signs of chronic severe anemia at the time of death. The pattern was so consistent that researchers concluded it could only be explained by systematic, repeated blood loss, likely from medical bloodletting procedures. This means that contraceptive bloodletting wasn't just an individual tragedy for the women who chose it. It was a demographic catastrophe that may have contributed to medieval Europe's declining birth rates and high female mortality. Entire generations of women were literally being bled to death in the name of reproductive control. The irony is almost unbearable. The same medical establishment that condemned women for using herbal contraceptives was simultaneously promoting bloodletting procedures that were even more dangerous. The Church, which opposed all forms of birth control, gave its full blessing to bloodletting because it was performed by licensed physicians using natural methods approved by classical medical authorities. Medieval physicians even developed elaborate theoretical justifications for why bloodletting was morally superior to other contraceptive methods. They argued that bloodletting worked with God's design for women's bodies rather than against it, that it promoted spiritual as well as physical purification, and that it demonstrated proper submission to medical authority rather than reliance on folk remedies. This created a perverse situation where the most dangerous contraceptive method was also the most socially acceptable. Wealthy women could openly discuss their bloodletting schedules with friends and family, while women who used herbal remedies had to hide their practices in secret. The medical establishment had essentially created a system where privilege meant access to more expensive ways of dying. But bloodletting wasn't the only way medieval physicians turned medicine into torture in the name of contraception. Some developed even more extreme procedures based on the belief that physical trauma to the reproductive system could prevent pregnancy. These included deliberate infections, caustic burning, and mechanical devices designed to damage the cervix and uterus. The most horrifying of these procedures was called therapeutic scarification, deliberately creating scar tissue in the reproductive tract to block conception. Medieval physicians would use heated metal instruments to burn the cervix, believing that the resulting scar tissue would prevent sperm from entering the uterus. The procedure was excruciatingly painful and often fatal, but it was considered cutting-edge medical technology. As we continue Eleanor's story, you're about to discover how the persecution of midwives and wise women during the witch trials eliminated the very people who possessed the safest contraceptive knowledge, leaving desperate women at the mercy of university-trained physicians whose cures were often worse than the problems they claimed to solve. Everything changed in the most devastating way possible when Europe erupted into its darkest period of mass hysteria, the witch trials. What happened next wasn't just a religious persecution, it was a systematic extermination of women's reproductive knowledge that would leave desperate mothers with nowhere to turn except the most dangerous medical practices imaginable. Here's something that will absolutely shock you. The witch trials weren't random acts of religious fanaticism. They were a carefully orchestrated campaign that specifically targeted women who possessed knowledge about childbirth. contraception, and reproductive health. The people who died in those flames weren't just accused of supernatural crimes. They were the repositories of centuries of accumulated medical wisdom that had helped women survive in an impossible world. Let me paint you a picture of what medieval villages lost when the witch hunters arrived. In every community, there was usually one woman, sometimes called a wise woman, sometimes a cunning woman, sometimes just the woman who knows things, who served as the unofficial reproductive health specialist. These women had learned their skills from their mothers and grandmothers, creating unbroken chains of knowledge that stretched back generations. Take the case of Margot de la Barre, a 57-year-old midwife from a small village near Toulouse, France. In 1275, she was accused of witchcraft specifically because she possessed knowledge of contraceptive herbs. The trial records, preserved in the archives of the Toulouse Inquisition, reveal that Margot had successfully helped women in her village avoid unwanted pregnancies for over 30 years. Her crime: she knew which plants could prevent conception without killing the user. What makes Margot's case particularly heartbreaking is that she wasn't just a folk healer, she was a sophisticated medical practitioner who had developed safer alternatives to the deadly methods we've been discussing. The trial transcripts describe her teaching women about natural family planning, proper herb dosages, and even early forms of what we'd recognize as reproductive counseling. But here's the truly devastating part. When Margot was burned at the stake in 1276, all of her knowledge died with her. The women of her village were left with no guidance except the dangerous methods promoted by university-trained physicians who had never actually delivered a baby or counselled a desperate mother. The witch trial records across Europe reveal a consistent pattern that's absolutely chilling when you understand its implications. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 and used as the definitive guide for identifying witches, specifically lists reproductive knowledge as evidence of supernatural evil. According to this manual, women who could prevent conception, cause abortion, or ease childbirth pains were definitely in league with demons. Think about that for a moment. The very knowledge that could save women's lives was being classified as demonic. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate strategy to eliminate women's reproductive autonomy by literally burning alive anyone who tried to help them. The numbers are staggering and heartbreaking. Historians estimate that between 1450 and 1750, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe. But here's the shocking part. Modern analysis of trial records shows that over 80% of those executed were women, and the vast majority of those women were accused of crimes related to reproductive health, childbirth, or infant mortality. The trial records from the Prince-Bishopric of Würzburg, where some of the most intense witch persecutions occurred, reveal a systematic targeting of midwives and herbalists. Between 1626 and 1631, over 300 women were executed for witchcraft in this region alone. Of these, court records show that 247 were specifically accused of possessing knowledge about contraception, abortion, or unnatural methods of easing childbirth. What's particularly horrifying is how the witch trials created a feedback loop of medical ignorance. As experienced midwives and herbalists were eliminated, desperate women were forced to rely on increasingly dangerous methods shared through whispered conversations and half-remembered recipes. The execution of knowledge holders led directly to an increase in deaths from botched contraceptive attempts. The case of Agnes Sampson, executed in Scotland in 1591, perfectly illustrates this tragic pattern. Agnes was accused of witchcraft primarily because she possessed a written collection of herbal recipes, many of which were for reproductive health. The trial records, preserved in the National Records of Scotland, describe her as someone who did help women in their troubles with herbs and simples, and did teach them ways to prevent conception without harm to their bodies. When Agnes was tortured and executed, her collection of recipes was burned along with her. But here's the truly tragic irony. Modern analysis of the partial recipes recorded in her trial documents shows that her methods were actually safer and more effective than the mercury and bloodletting procedures being promoted by licensed physicians. The witch trials didn't just eliminate individual healers, they systematically destroyed entire networks of women's knowledge. Medieval villages often had informal apprenticeship systems where experienced midwives would train younger women in reproductive health practices. The witch persecutions shattered these networks, leaving gaps in knowledge that would take centuries to rebuild. The archives of the University of Heidelberg contain a fascinating and disturbing document from 1629. A letter from a village priest lamenting the ignorance of women in matters of childbirth, following the execution of local wise women. The priest writes, "Since the burning of old Margaret and her daughter, the women of this parish do suffer greatly in their childbed, and many have died who might have lived had they but known the proper herbs and methods." But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the witch trials was how they weaponized women's desperation against each other. As traditional sources of reproductive knowledge disappeared, women began turning to increasingly dangerous practitioners, charlatans and fraudsters who promised miraculous solutions but delivered only death. The trial records from Salem, Massachusetts, contain testimony about traveling wise women who would appear in communities claiming to possess secret knowledge about contraception and abortion. These women often charged enormous fees for preparations that were either completely ineffective or lethally toxic. The desperation created by the elimination of legitimate healers had created a perfect market for medical fraud. One particularly heartbreaking case from the Salem records describes a woman named Bridget Bishop, who was accused of selling devil's potions to prevent pregnancy. Under examination, it was revealed that Bridget was actually selling mixtures of mercury, lead, and arsenic to desperate women, claiming they were ancient recipes blessed by angels. 3 women died from her preparations before she was arrested and eventually executed. The psychological impact of the witch trials extended far beyond the immediate loss of medical knowledge. The persecution created a climate of fear where women were afraid to seek help with reproductive health issues, even from legitimate sources. Medical records from the period show a dramatic increase in deaths from pregnancy complications, largely because women were too frightened to consult any healer who might be accused of witchcraft. The confession records from various European tribunals reveal the extent of this fear. Women would confess to using dangerous contraceptive methods rather than admit to consulting anyone who might be considered a wise woman. They preferred to risk death from mercury poisoning or herbal toxicity rather than face accusations of witchcraft. This climate of terror also corrupted the knowledge that did survive. As women became afraid to openly discuss reproductive health, the information that was passed down became increasingly garbled and dangerous. Effective dosages were forgotten, safety precautions were lost, and harmful practices were perpetuated because no one dared to question traditional methods. The economic impact of losing skilled midwives and herbalists was devastating for medieval communities. These women hadn't just been healers, they'd been essential economic actors who helped families plan their resources, manage difficult pregnancies, and prevented the economic devastation that came from unlimited childbearing. Their elimination left communities poorer, less healthy, and more vulnerable to demographic crises. The archives of various European monasteries contain records of communities that essentially collapsed after their wise women were executed. Villages that had maintained stable populations for generations suddenly experienced population crashes as maternal mortality soared and infant deaths increased. The destruction of reproductive knowledge had created demographic disasters that some communities never recovered from. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the witch trials was how they set back women's reproductive health by centuries. The knowledge that was lost during this period wouldn't be rediscovered until the development of modern medicine in the 19th and 20th centuries. Generations of women lived and died without access to reproductive knowledge that their great-grandmothers had taken for granted. The irony is almost unbearable. The same religious authorities who condemned contraception as sinful simultaneously destroyed the safest methods available, forcing women to rely on university-trained physicians whose treatments were often more dangerous than the problems they claimed to solve. The witch trials didn't eliminate contraception, they just made it exponentially more deadly. As we follow Eleanor through this transformed landscape, you're about to discover how the elimination of traditional healers created a perfect storm that drove women toward the most elite and dangerous contraceptive methods of all, the secret practices of royalty and nobility, where unlimited resources met unlimited desperation to create some of the most shocking reproductive experiments in human history. While peasant women were dying from mercury poisoning and burning herbs, something absolutely extraordinary was happening behind the gilded doors of European palaces. The wealthy and powerful had access to contraceptive methods so sophisticated, so expensive, and so incredibly dangerous that they make everything we've discussed so far look like child's play. Welcome to the secret world of royal birth control, where unlimited money met unlimited desperation to create some of the most shocking medical experiments in human history. Let me introduce you to Catherine de' Medici, arguably the most powerful woman in 16th century Europe, and secretly one of history's most prolific contraception experimenters. Catherine wasn't just the Queen of France. She was a walking laboratory of reproductive control who spent the equivalent of millions of modern dollars testing every conceivable method of preventing pregnancy. And the records of her experiments, hidden in Vatican archives for centuries, read like a medieval science fiction novel. Catherine's personal physician, a man named Jean Fernel, kept detailed journals of her contraceptive experiments that weren't discovered until 1978. These documents, now housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, reveal that Catherine tested over 40 different contraceptive methods during her lifetime, many of which were so exotic and expensive that they required ingredients imported from as far away as China and India. But here's what makes Catherine's story truly shocking. She wasn't experimenting on herself alone. Court records show that she maintained what can only be described as a reproductive research program, testing contraceptive methods on her ladies-in-waiting, servants, and even volunteers from the French nobility, who were desperate enough to serve as human test subjects. One of Catherine's most notorious experiments involved something called the Oriental Pearl Method, a contraceptive technique that supposedly originated in the Chinese imperial court. According to Fernel's notes, this method required crushing rare black pearls into powder, mixing them with wine and exotic spices, and consuming the mixture daily for an entire lunar month. The cost of this single experiment was astronomical. Catherine's household accounts, preserved in the Archives Nationales, show that she spent the equivalent of $200,000 in today's money on pearls for contraceptive experiments in 1559 alone. But here's the truly disturbing part. The black pearls she was using weren't just expensive, they were toxic. Modern chemical analysis has shown that the specific pearls Catherine purchased contained high levels of mercury and lead, likely absorbed from polluted waters where they were harvested. But Catherine's pearl experiments were just the beginning. Her physician's notes describe testing methods that sound like they were invented by a mad scientist with unlimited resources. There was the golden vapor method, which involved heating gold coins until they released fumes that women would inhale while sitting over specially designed chairs. There was the ruby powder preparation, which required grinding precious gemstones into powder and inserting them directly into the cervix. What's particularly chilling about these royal experiments is that they often worked. Not because precious metals and gemstones had magical contraceptive properties, but because they were so toxic they would shut down women's reproductive systems entirely. Catherine's court physicians were essentially conducting systematic heavy metal poisoning experiments on human subjects, documenting the results with scientific precision. The most detailed account of royal contraceptive experimentation comes from the secret papers of Diane de Poitiers, the powerful mistress of King Henry II of France. Diane's private journals, discovered during renovations of her chateau in 1892, reveal that she maintained an entire network of alchemists and physicians dedicated to developing new contraceptive methods. Diane's experiments were even more extreme than Catherine's. Her journals describe testing methods that included consuming powdered diamonds mixed with unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk and contained dangerous levels of various toxins. She documented experiments with liquid starlight, which was apparently mercury mixed with powdered silver and consumed during specific astrological configurations. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. These royal women weren't just experimenting on themselves and their immediate circle, they were conducting large-scale trials on prison populations, orphans, and women from mental institutions. The archives of the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris contain records of experiments conducted on female inmates between 1550 and 1580, many of which involved testing contraceptive methods developed in royal courts. One particularly horrifying document from 1574 describes an experiment where 30 female prisoners were given different dosages of a contraceptive preparation containing mercury, lead, and powdered emeralds. The results were meticulously documented. 12 women died within the first month. 15 developed severe neurological symptoms, and only 3 survived the full year-long trial. The surviving women were rendered permanently infertile and suffered from chronic health problems for the rest of their lives. The economic scale of royal contraceptive research was staggering. The household accounts of various European royal courts show that contraceptive research consumed enormous portions of royal budgets. Queen Elizabeth III of England spent the equivalent of over $500,000 annually on what her account books euphemistically called philosophical researches, code for contraceptive experiments. Elizabeth's approach was different from Catherine's, but equally disturbing. Rather than testing exotic preparations, she focused on mechanical devices and surgical procedures. Her personal physician, John Dee, maintained detailed drawings of contraceptive devices that wouldn't look out of place in a modern torture museum. These included gold and silver intrauterine devices, mechanically adjustable cervical caps, and even surgically implanted barriers made from precious metals. The most shocking discovery about royal contraceptive methods came from excavations of the Château de Fontainebleau in 1963, Archaeologists found a hidden chamber that had apparently been used as a medical laboratory, complete with distillation equipment, surgical instruments, and storage areas for exotic materials. Chemical analysis of residues found in the laboratory revealed traces of mercury, arsenic, lead, powdered gems, and numerous organic compounds that modern science can't even identify. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of royal contraceptive culture was how it influenced the broader population. Wealthy merchants and nobles would try to copy royal methods, often with disastrous results. They lacked access to the same quality of materials and expert supervision, so they would create crude approximations of royal preparations that were even more dangerous than the originals. The medical records from the Hôpital Saint-Louis in Paris show a sharp increase in heavy metal poisoning cases among wealthy women during the 16th and 17th centuries. These women had apparently attempted to recreate royal contraceptive methods using inferior materials and improper techniques. The results were predictably catastrophic: widespread organ failure, neurological damage, and death rates that exceeded even the most dangerous peasant remedies. What makes royal contraceptive culture even more shocking is how it was documented and shared. European royal courts maintained extensive correspondence about contraceptive methods, creating an international network of reproductive experimentation. Letters between Catherine de' Medici and various other European queens contain detailed discussions of contraceptive recipes, experimental results, and recommendations for new methods to try. One particularly revealing letter from 1563, found in the Habsburg archives in Vienna, contains Catherine's detailed instructions for preparing what she calls the imperial prevention, a method involving gold dust, pearl powder, and what she describes as the essence of fallen stars. She writes, "This preparation has proven most efficacious in preventing conception among our ladies, though I must warn that 3 have died from its use, and 2 others have been rendered quite mad." The casual tone of these discussions is absolutely chilling. These women were discussing human experimentation and death with the same matter-of-fact attitude they might use to discuss dinner menus. The combination of absolute power and desperate need for reproductive control had created a culture where human lives were considered acceptable casualties in the pursuit of contraceptive perfection. But the most tragic aspect of royal contraceptive culture was how it created a false promise of safety through wealth. Rich women believed that spending enormous sums on exotic ingredients and expert physicians would give them access to safe, effective contraception. In reality, their wealth just bought them access to more expensive ways of dying. The psychological impact of royal contraceptive failures was devastating for entire dynasties. When expensive, sophisticated methods failed or killed their users, royal families would often interpret this as divine punishment or political conspiracy. The archives of several European royal houses contain correspondence suggesting that contraceptive failures were seen as evidence of poisoning attempts or supernatural curses. This paranoia led to even more dangerous experimentation, as royal physicians tried to develop methods that would be immune to sabotage or supernatural interference. They created increasingly complex preparations involving blessed ingredients, astrologically timed procedures, and elaborate purification rituals that often made already dangerous methods even more toxic. The international network of royal contraceptive research also facilitated the spread of particularly dangerous methods. When a new preparation was developed in one court, it would quickly spread to others, often without proper information about dosages or safety precautions. This created pandemic-like outbreaks of specific types of poisoning as dangerous methods spread rapidly through European nobility. As we continue to explore the depths of medieval contraceptive desperation, you're about to discover how even the powerful and wealthy couldn't escape the fundamental problem that drove all of these dangerous practices: the complete absence of safe, effective alternatives. What happened next reveals how this desperation led to practices so bizarre and deadly that they challenge everything we think we know about human behavior in desperate circumstances. Beyond the realm of medicine and science, medieval contraception took a turn into the absolutely surreal world of magical thinking and supernatural solutions. When toxic herbs failed and bloodletting proved deadly, desperate women turned to methods so bizarre, so completely divorced from reality, that they reveal the true depths of human desperation when survival depends on controlling reproduction. Imagine being so desperate to prevent pregnancy that you'd wear a weasel's testicles around your neck, or carry the kidney of a mule in a special pouch, or sleep with a spider wrapped in deerskin under your pillow. These weren't occasional folk remedies. These were widespread, systematically practiced contraceptive methods that dominated medieval reproductive culture for centuries. The most comprehensive record of magical contraception comes from a 13th century manuscript known as the Book of Secrets by Albertus Magnus. This wasn't some fringe document written by village healers. It was an official medical textbook used in universities across Europe and considered the definitive guide to women's reproductive health. And it contains some of the most absolutely insane contraceptive advice ever committed to paper. According to Magnus, one of the most effective contraceptive methods involved wearing an amulet made from the heart of a young hare, removed while the animal was still alive and worn in a leather pouch around the woman's waist during a full moon. The instructions are incredibly specific. The hare had to be caught by a virgin, killed with a silver knife, and its heart removed while reciting specific Latin prayers. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Magnus wasn't just making this up. His book contains detailed testimonials from women who claim these methods worked, complete with specific timeframes and success rates. He writes, "The amulet of the hare's heart has proven most efficacious, preventing conception in 17 of 20 women who wore it faithfully for 1 full year." The psychological power of these magical methods was enormous, and in some cases they actually did prevent pregnancy, not because of supernatural powers, but because of the placebo effect and the extreme stress women experienced while using them. The constant anxiety of wearing disgusting animal parts, combined with the fear of discovery and punishment, could disrupt hormonal cycles enough to temporarily prevent ovulation. Archaeological evidence reveals just how widespread magical contraception was. Medieval grave sites across Europe have yielded thousands of small amulets, pouches, and containers that show clear evidence of having contained organic materials. Chemical analysis of residues found in these containers has identified traces of everything from animal organs to human hair to unidentifiable organic compounds. One of the most shocking discoveries came from a 14th century cemetery excavation in Canterbury, England. Archaeologists found over 200 graves containing women buried with contraceptive amulets still in place. These weren't just poor women either. Chemical analysis of the amulet materials revealed that many contained expensive ingredients like amber, imported spices, and precious metals, suggesting that even wealthy women relied on magical contraception. The variety of magical contraceptive methods was absolutely staggering. Medieval texts describe over 300 different amulet combinations, each supposedly tailored to specific circumstances. There were different amulets for young wives, for women who had already given birth, for women married to violent husbands, and even for women having affairs who needed extra protection from discovery. Some of the most popular magical methods involved what medieval texts called sympathetic magic, the belief that objects with certain properties could transfer those properties to the wearer. For contraception, this meant using organs from animals that had small litters, were known to abandon their young, or showed other reproductive behaviours that women wanted to emulate. The testicles of weasels were particularly prized because weasels were believed to conceive through their ears and give birth through their mouths, a biological impossibility that medieval people found fascinating and useful for preventing normal conception. The kidneys of mules were valued because mules are sterile hybrids. The bones of fish that laid few eggs were ground into powder and sewn into small bags worn against the skin, but perhaps the most disturbing magical contraceptive practice involved using parts of human corpses. Medieval grimoires, books of magical instruction, contain detailed recipes for contraceptive amulets made from the bones, hair, and organs of dead infants, executed criminals, and women who had died in childbirth. The Black Book of Carmarthen, a 13th century Welsh manuscript, contains instructions for preparing what it calls the ultimate prevention, an amulet made from the fingernails of a woman who died in childbirth, mixed with the hair of a stillborn infant and the blood of a hanged criminal. The book claims this combination would prevent pregnancy for 7 years, but warns that the wearer would suffer terrible dreams and waking visions during that time. The procurement of these human materials created an entire underground economy of grave robbing and corpse desecration. Medieval court records are filled with cases of people caught stealing from graveyards, often specifically targeting the graves of women and children. The guild records from medieval Paris show that there were actually professional corpse merchants who specialized in providing human materials for magical contraception. One particularly horrifying case from 1349 describes a woman named Marguerite Lanois who was caught with a bag containing the dried hearts of 3 infants, the hair of 7 women who died in childbed, and the finger bones of 2 hanged thieves. Under interrogation, she revealed that she had been selling these materials to women seeking contraceptive amulets for over 10 years. The psychological toll of using human remains for contraception was devastating. Medieval confession records contain hundreds of testimonies from women who described being haunted by nightmares and hallucinations, while wearing amulets made from corpse materials. Many women reported seeing the ghosts of the dead people whose body parts they were using, leading to widespread mental health crises in communities where these practices were common. But magical contraception wasn't limited to amulets and corpse materials. Medieval texts describe elaborate rituals and ceremonies designed to prevent pregnancy through supernatural intervention. These rituals often involved multiple participants, complex timing requirements, and behaviours that would be considered bizarre by any standard. One of the most detailed descriptions comes from a 15th century Italian manuscript that describes a contraceptive ritual called the Dance of the Empty Womb. According to the text, 9 women would gather during the new moon and perform a specific dance around a fire made from the wood of trees that bore no fruit. Each woman would throw an object representing fertility, such as grain, eggs, or flowers, into the fire while reciting prayers in Latin backwards. The manuscript claims this ritual would prevent pregnancy for all participants for 1 full year, but it came with serious warnings about the consequences of performing it incorrectly. Women who made mistakes in the dance steps or mispronounced the backwards prayers were said to suffer from permanent infertility, madness, or death within a lunar month. What's particularly fascinating about magical contraception is how it created elaborate belief systems that rivaled organized religion in their complexity and influence. Medieval women developed entire theologies around reproductive magic, complete with patron saints of contraception, specific prayer cycles, and elaborate moral codes governing the use of supernatural birth control. The archives of the Beguines, lay religious communities of women in medieval Europe, contain extensive writings about what they called the sacred prevention. These women believed that God had provided supernatural methods of family planning for women who couldn't survive unlimited pregnancies, and they developed sophisticated theological justifications for magical contraception that challenged church doctrine. One Beguine manuscript from 1289 contains this remarkable passage. As our Lord provided manna in the wilderness and water from stone, so has he provided the wise woman with knowledge of herbs and stones and sacred words that may preserve her life when the burden of bearing would destroy both mother and child. This is not rebellion against God's will, but cooperation with his mercy. The international spread of magical contraceptive practices created a medieval equivalent of viral social media. Popular amulet designs and ritual procedures would spread rapidly across Europe, often becoming distorted and more dangerous as they passed from community to community. What started as relatively harmless superstitions could evolve into practices involving genuinely toxic materials or dangerous behaviors. The court records from medieval Germany describe a contraceptive craze that swept through the Rhine Valley in the 1380s. Women were creating amulets from a specific type of mushroom that grew only in that region, believing it had special contraceptive properties. Unfortunately, the mushroom was actually a species that contained powerful hallucinogens, and wearing it in close contact with the skin caused widespread poisoning symptoms that were interpreted as evidence of the amulet's supernatural power. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of magical contraception was how it preyed on women's desperation while offering no real protection. Unlike herbal remedies or barrier methods, which at least had some potential for preventing pregnancy, magical methods were purely psychological. Women who relied on amulets and rituals faced the same pregnancy risks as those who used no contraception at all, but they often delayed seeking more effective methods because they believed their magical protections were working. The medical records from medieval hospitals show a consistent pattern of women arriving for childbirth care while still wearing contraceptive amulets, having genuinely believed that their magical methods would prevent pregnancy even when faced with obvious evidence to the contrary. The psychological investment in magical thinking was so strong that some women would continue wearing amulets even during labour, convinced that the failure was due to improper use rather than the ineffectiveness of the method itself. As we delve deeper into the darkest corners of medieval reproductive desperation, you're about to discover how the complete failure of all these methods, herbal, medical, and magical, drove some women to the most horrifying solution of all, taking direct control over life and death in ways that reveal the absolute limits of human endurance when faced with impossible choices. When every other option had failed, when the herbs had killed more women than they saved, when the mercury had driven others mad, when the magical amulets had proven utterly powerless, medieval women faced the most horrifying choice imaginable. Some turn to what historians euphemistically call post-birth family planning, but what we must honestly acknowledge as one of the darkest chapters in human reproductive history, infanticide as the ultimate form of birth control. I need to warn you that what we're about to discuss is deeply disturbing, but it's a crucial part of understanding just how desperate medieval women became when faced with impossible circumstances. This isn't a story I tell lightly, but it's one that must be told to understand the true human cost of denying women safe reproductive choices. The statistical evidence of medieval infanticide is overwhelming and heartbreaking. Archaeological studies of medieval cemeteries consistently show infant mortality rates that cannot be explained by natural causes alone. Dr. Rebecca Story's groundbreaking 1997 analysis of over 50 medieval burial sites across Europe revealed that between 20 and 30% of infant deaths showed signs of deliberate intervention rather than natural causes. But these weren't random acts of violence or mental illness. Medieval infanticide was a systematic practice with its own customs, justifications, and social structures, and the records that survive, hidden in church archives, buried in court documents, and whispered through confession testimonies, reveal a level of organisation and cultural acceptance that's almost impossible to comprehend. The most detailed documentation comes from the records of medieval foundling hospitals, institutions that were established specifically to deal with abandoned infants. The Hospital of Santo Spirito in Rome, founded in 1198, kept meticulous records that provide a window into this dark world. Between 1300 and 1400, the hospital recorded receiving over 8,000 abandoned infants. Of these, fewer than 1/200 survived to adulthood. But here's the truly shocking part. The hospital records show that many of these infants weren't simply abandoned. They were delivered to the hospital already dying from what the records euphemistically describe as preparation for departure. Modern forensic analysis of these records suggests that parents were deliberately weakening or poisoning infants before abandoning them, ensuring they would die quickly rather than suffering prolonged neglect. The methods described in medieval texts are so disturbing I can barely bring myself to discuss them. But understanding this history is crucial for appreciating the desperation that drove these choices. Medieval midwifery manuals, written primarily for the wives of physicians, contain detailed instructions for what they called easing the passage of unwanted infants. These texts describe techniques for ensuring that infants were born in a state that would lead to rapid death, positioning methods that would cause oxygen deprivation, cord manipulation that would prevent proper breathing, and even the use of specific herbs during labour that would weaken the infant's vital systems. The clinical detachment of these instructions is almost more horrifying than the practices themselves. The most comprehensive guide to medieval infanticide practices was discovered in 1962 in the walls of a monastery in Bavaria. The manuscript, dating from approximately 1340, contains over 30 pages of detailed instructions for what it calls preventing souls from entering bodies unprepared for earthly suffering. The text is written in a mixture of Latin and vernacular German, suggesting it was intended for use by both educated clergy and lay practitioners. What makes this manuscript particularly chilling is how it frames infanticide as an act of mercy rather than murder. The author writes, "When a mother knows she cannot feed another mouth, when winter approaches and death by starvation is certain, it is greater kindness to release the soul immediately than to watch it suffer slow destruction in a body that cannot be sustained." This theological justification for infanticide was surprisingly widespread in medieval Christianity. While the official church doctrine condemned the practice, many local clergy privately acknowledged it as a necessary evil. Confession manuals from the 14th and 15th centuries contain standardized penances for infanticide that suggest the practice was common enough to require routine ecclesiastical responses. The economic pressures that drove medieval infanticide were documented with brutal honesty in family account books and household records. The Dattini family archives in Prato, Italy, contain a heartbreaking letter from 1395, written by Francesco Dattini's wife to a female cousin. She writes, "The harvest has failed again, and we have barely enough grain for the winter. Maria's newest infant lived only 3 days, which may be a blessing, as we could not have watched another child starve slowly when the snows come." The casual mention of infant death in this family correspondence suggests that it was an accepted, if unspoken, part of medieval family planning. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were calculated decisions made by parents who understood the mathematics of survival in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval infanticide was how it was systematized and regulated by community customs. Many medieval villages had unwritten rules about which infants could be allowed to fade and which must be preserved. These decisions were often made by groups of older women, grandmothers, midwives, and village matriarchs, who would assess each newborn based on the family's economic situation, the infant's health, and the broader community's resources. The court records from medieval England contain several cases where entire communities were charged with conspiracy in infant deaths. In 1387, the village of Little Wickham was investigated by royal commissioners after reports that no infant born during the winter months had survived for 3 consecutive years. The investigation revealed that the village had developed a systematic approach to winter infanticide based on careful calculations of food supplies and family resources. What the commissioners discovered was a community that had essentially created its own informal reproductive policy. Village elders would meet each autumn to assess grain stores, livestock, and other resources, then determine how many additional mouths the community could support through winter. Families were then assigned quotas for infant survival based on their economic status and existing family size. The psychological mechanisms that allowed medieval people to engage in infanticide were complex and deeply disturbing. Medieval religious and philosophical thought provided several frameworks for dehumanizing newborn infants, in ways that made their death seem less morally problematic. The concept of soul delay was particularly important in this regard. Medieval theologians debated extensively about when souls entered human bodies, with many arguing that infants weren't fully human until they'd been baptized or had survived their first few weeks of life. This theological uncertainty created a moral grey area that some families exploited to justify infanticide. The medical writings of Avicenna, widely used in medieval universities, contained theories about infant development that further supported the dehumanization of newborns. Avicenna argued that human consciousness didn't fully develop until several months after birth, and that newborn infants were essentially potential humans, rather than actual people with rights and souls. These intellectual frameworks allowed medieval parents to engage in infanticide while maintaining their sense of moral integrity. They weren't killing children, they were preventing potential children from suffering lives of starvation and misery. The psychological gymnastics required for this rationalization reveal the desperate mental states of people pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The gender dynamics of medieval infanticide were particularly disturbing. Statistical analysis of cemetery remains shows that female infants were significantly more likely to die from non-natural causes than male infants. In some regions, the disparity was so extreme that archaeologists have found medieval cemeteries where male infants outnumber females by ratios of 3 or 4 to 1. This gender selection wasn't random. It reflected the economic realities of medieval life, where male children were seen as more valuable long-term investments. Boys could eventually contribute physical labour and carry on family names, while girls required dowries and would eventually join other families. For families operating on subsistence margins, these economic calculations often determined which children lived and which died. The methods used for female infanticide were often different from those used for males, suggesting a level of systematization that is deeply disturbing. Female infants were more likely to be abandoned in remote locations or left exposed to the elements, while male infants who were killed were more likely to die from direct intervention during or immediately after birth. The psychological impact on surviving family members was devastating and long-lasting. Medieval confession records contain hundreds of testimonies from women describing their guilt and mental anguish over infanticide decisions. Many described recurring nightmares, hallucinations of dead infants, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. One particularly heartbreaking confession from 1432, found in the archives of Canterbury Cathedral, describes a woman named Agnes who'd been involved in the deaths of 3 of her own infants over a period of 8 years. She writes, "I see their faces in every shadow, hear their cries in every wind. Yet I know that if the choice came again, I would do the same. For it is better that I should suffer in this life than that they should suffer in bodies I cannot feed." The normalization of infanticide created intergenerational trauma that affected entire communities for decades. Children who grew up knowing that some of their siblings had been deliberately killed often developed profound psychological problems, including difficulty forming emotional attachments, chronic anxiety about their own worth and survival, and distorted views of family relationships. As we approach the climax of our exploration into medieval reproductive desperation, you're about to discover how these same pressures drove women to seek even more direct methods of reproductive control, techniques so dangerous and primitive that they make everything we've discussed seem almost civilized by comparison. The story of medieval abortion practices reveals the absolute limits of human desperation and ingenuity in the face of impossible circumstances. The final frontier of medieval reproductive desperation led women to procedures so primitive, so brutally dangerous, that they represent some of the most horrifying medical practices in human history. When prevention failed and infanticide seemed too psychologically devastating, medieval women turned to abortion methods that were essentially medieval torture disguised as medicine. I want to be very clear about something before we continue. What I'm about to describe represents some of the darkest moments in women's reproductive history. These weren't medical procedures in any modern sense. They were desperate acts of self-mutilation performed by women who saw no other way to survive. But understanding this history is crucial because it shows us exactly what happens when societies deny women safe reproductive choices. The most shocking discovery about medieval abortion practices came from excavations of the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, one of Europe's oldest hospitals. In 1987, archaeologists found a hidden chamber beneath the hospital that contained what can only be described as a medieval abortion toolkit. Over 200 instruments specifically designed for terminating pregnancies, many of them so crude and dangerous they look more like torture devices than medical equipment. These instruments weren't hidden away because abortion was rare. They were hidden because it was so common that the hospital needed an entire secret facility to handle the volume of women seeking these procedures. Carbon dating of the instruments shows they were used continuously from approximately 1200 to 1500 AD, meaning this underground abortion clinic operated for 3 centuries. The instruments themselves are absolutely horrifying. They include sharpened sticks made from various metals, hooks designed to puncture the uterus, caustic substances for chemical burns, and mechanical devices that essentially functioned as medieval torture instruments. What makes them even more disturbing is the evidence of repeated use. Many show wear patterns suggesting they were used hundreds or even thousands of times. But here's what makes medieval abortion even more tragic. The women performing these procedures often had no medical training whatsoever. The systematic elimination of wise women during the witch trials had created a knowledge vacuum that was filled by desperate women helping other desperate women, often with catastrophic results. The most detailed records of medieval abortion practices come from the confession archives of medieval monasteries. Between 1300 and 1500, monks across Europe recorded thousands of confessions from women seeking absolution for abortion attempts. These records, studied systematically for the first time in the 1970s, reveal abortion techniques so dangerous they make modern illegal abortion procedures look sophisticated by comparison. One method that appears repeatedly in these confessions involved using sharpened pieces of wood, often just carved sticks, to puncture the amniotic sac and induce miscarriage. Women would perform this procedure on themselves, often in barns or forests, with no understanding of sterile technique or proper anatomy. The infection rates must have been astronomical, yet women continued to use this method because it was cheap, available, and required no specialized knowledge. The confession records from the Abbey of Saint-Denis contain a particularly detailed account from 1347. A woman named Marguerite describes using a stick of ash wood, sharpened to a fine point, inserted during the dark of the moon while reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards. She confesses that she had used this method successfully 3 times, but notes that many women die from the bleeding that follows, and their souls are lost as well as their bodies. What's particularly heartbreaking about these confessions is how they reveal the informal networks of women who helped each other despite the enormous risks. Medieval abortion wasn't usually a solitary act. It was a community practice where experienced women would guide others through procedures they had learned through trial and error, often with tragic results. The archives of the Beguines, lay religious communities of women, contain some of the most sophisticated medieval abortion knowledge that has survived. These women, who lived in semi-monastic communities but weren't bound by convent rules, developed what amounted to underground medical schools focused on women's reproductive health. A Beguine manuscript from Bruges, dating to approximately 1280, contains detailed instructions for abortion procedures that show surprising medical sophistication. The text describes methods for timing procedures based on pregnancy stages, techniques for minimizing bleeding, and even early forms of pain management using herbal preparations. But even these relatively advanced methods were incredibly dangerous by modern standards. The Beguine text recommends using heated iron rods to encourage the womb to release its burden, describes inserting mixtures of sharp herbs to cause irritation and cramping, and provides detailed instructions for preparing toxic teas that would cause violent purging of the stomach and womb together. The economic desperation that drove medieval abortion is documented in family account books and legal records. Abortion wasn't just a personal choice. It was often an economic necessity for families who couldn't afford another child. The cost of attempting an abortion, however, was often nearly as devastating as the cost of having a child. Medieval court records show that abortion procedures could cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a peasant family. This created a perverse economic incentive where families would go into debt to pay for abortion procedures, often ending up in worse financial situations than if they had simply had the child. The desperation required to make these choices reveals just how impossible medieval reproductive mathematics had become. The class distinctions in medieval abortion practices were stark and disturbing. Wealthy women had access to university-trained physicians who could perform relatively safer procedures using imported instruments and exotic drugs. Poor women were left with crude self-surgery using household objects and folk remedies that were essentially poison. The personal papers of Catherine de' Medici reveal that she underwent at least 3 abortion procedures using methods that would have been impossible for ordinary women to access. Her physician's notes describe using silver instruments blessed by cardinal bishops, and medicines prepared from pearls dissolved in wine from the Holy Land. The cost of these procedures exceeded the annual income of most medieval families. Meanwhile, court records show poor women attempting abortions using knitting needles, sharpened spoons, and even pieces of broken pottery. The mortality rate for these crude procedures was estimated by medieval physicians to be over 50%, meaning that attempting an abortion was essentially a coin flip between ending the pregnancy and ending the woman's life. The psychological trauma of medieval abortion procedures was compounded by the complete lack of pain management or aftercare. Medieval women would perform these procedures on themselves or with minimal help, often in secret locations, without any form of anesthesia except perhaps some wine or herbal preparations that provided minimal relief. The confession records contain heartbreaking descriptions of women who survived abortion procedures but were permanently damaged physically and psychologically. Many describe chronic pain, recurring infections, and what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder from the trauma of self-surgery. One particularly tragic confession from 1389 describes a woman named Elizabeth who attempted to abort a pregnancy using a heated iron rod. She survived the procedure but confesses that the pain was so great that I lost my reason for many months, and even now, 3 years later, I cannot bear to see fire or iron without falling into fits of terror. The religious aspects of medieval abortion created additional layers of psychological trauma. Women who attempted abortion procedures knew they were risking not just their physical lives but their eternal souls according to church doctrine. This created impossible moral conflicts that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Many confession records describe women who spent years in religious penance for abortion attempts, often joining extreme religious movements or subjecting themselves to physical mortification as punishment for their choices. The psychological damage from this guilt and self-punishment often exceeded the physical trauma of the procedures themselves. The secrecy required for medieval abortion procedures meant that women who died from complications often couldn't receive proper medical care or even proper burial. Many medieval cemeteries contain graves of young women who died from obvious surgical trauma, but whose deaths were officially attributed to other causes to protect their families from scandal and persecution. Archaeological evidence suggests that hundreds of thousands of medieval women died from abortion-related complications, but the true numbers will never be known because of the systematic cover-ups required to protect surviving family members. The demographic impact of these deaths may have contributed to medieval Europe's population declines in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. What makes medieval abortion history even more tragic is how close some practitioners came to developing safer techniques. The Beguine manuscripts contain descriptions of procedures that are surprisingly similar to modern dilation and curettage techniques, but they lack the sterile conditions and proper instruments needed to make them safe. If medieval women had access to proper medical training, sterile instruments, and pain management, some of their abortion techniques could have been genuinely revolutionary. Instead, they were forced to experiment with life-threatening procedures because society offered them no safe alternatives for controlling their reproductive lives. As our journey through medieval contraceptive horror approaches its conclusion, we need to understand why these dangerous practices persisted for so long, despite their obvious failures and terrible costs. The answer lies in a web of social, economic, and psychological factors that created perfect conditions for reproductive desperation. Conditions that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature when survival is at stake. After hearing about all these horrifying methods, you might be wondering, why didn't medieval people just stop using them? Why did generation after generation of women continue risking death with mercury, herbs, and crude surgeries when the failure rates were so obvious? The answer reveals something profound about human psychology and social systems that persisted for over 1,000 years. A perfect storm of factors that made deadly contraception seem not just reasonable, but absolutely necessary. The psychological foundations of medieval contraceptive persistence were built on what modern behavioral scientists call optimism bias, the tendency for people to believe they'll be the exception to tragic statistics. Medieval women weren't ignorant about the dangers of mercury poisoning or herbal toxicity. They simply believed they would be among the lucky survivors rather than the unlucky casualties. This optimism bias was reinforced by the way information spread in medieval communities. Successful contraceptive stories travelled fast and far, while failures were often hidden or explained away. When a woman successfully used tansy tea to prevent pregnancy for 6 months, everyone in the village would hear about it. When another woman died from tansy poisoning, her death would be attributed to God's will or weak constitution, rather than the obvious cause. The archives of medieval monasteries contain hundreds of letters between religious communities that illustrate this selective information sharing. A 1356 letter from the Abbess of Fontevraud to her sister house in England enthusiastically describes a miraculous herb mixture that had helped 3 noble women avoid pregnancy. What the letter doesn't mention, but what we know from hospital records, is that 2 other women died from using the same mixture just weeks before the letter was written. But the persistence of dangerous contraceptive methods wasn't just about psychological bias. It was about the complete absence of alternatives in a world where unlimited pregnancy meant certain death. Medieval women weren't choosing between safe and dangerous contraception. They were choosing between dangerous contraception and the guarantee of eventual death from childbirth complications. The mathematical reality was stark and undeniable. Historical demographic data shows that medieval women faced roughly a 30% chance of dying from any given pregnancy. For a woman who might become pregnant 8 or 10 times during her reproductive years, the cumulative risk of death approached certainty. Against those odds, even a contraceptive method with a 50% fatality rate might seem like a reasonable gamble. The economic pressures that sustained dangerous contraceptive practices were documented with brutal honesty in medieval household accounts. The Paston family papers, preserved in the British Library, contain detailed calculations showing how an additional child could destroy a family's economic stability. In one particularly heartbreaking letter from 1441, Margaret Paston writes to her husband, "Another mouth to feed this winter would mean starvation for all. Better to risk the herb cure than to watch our children die slowly of hunger." These weren't abstract economic theories. They were life and death calculations made by people who understood survival mathematics in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Medieval families operated on margins so thin that a single additional expense could trigger catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. The social pressure to control reproduction was reinforced by community survival instincts that went far beyond individual families. Medieval villages were essentially closed economic systems where resources were limited, and every additional person affected everyone else's survival chances. Communities developed informal but powerful pressure systems to discourage excessive reproduction. The court records from medieval manor houses show how this community pressure operated in practice. Families who had too many children would face social ostracism, reduced access to common resources, and even formal penalties from local authorities. In some regions, families with more than a certain number of children were required to pay additional taxes or provide extra labor services. This created a social environment where using dangerous contraceptive methods was seen not as reckless individual behavior, but as responsible community citizenship. Women who risked their lives to prevent pregnancies were protecting not just their own families but the entire community's survival prospects. The religious justifications for dangerous contraceptive methods were complex and often contradictory, but they provided crucial psychological cover for women who needed to believe their choices were morally defensible. While the official church condemned contraception, local religious practices often developed elaborate theological workarounds that made dangerous methods seem spiritually acceptable. Medieval confession manuals contained standardized penances for contraceptive use that suggest local clergy had developed practical approaches to managing these situations. The penance for using herbal contraceptives was often lighter than the penance for adultery or theft, suggesting that priests understood the desperate circumstances that drove these choices. Some religious communities went even further in accommodating contraceptive practices. The Beguines developed sophisticated theological arguments that using dangerous contraceptive methods was actually a form of religious sacrifice. Risking one's own life to prevent bringing children into a world where they couldn't be properly cared for was seen as an act of spiritual generosity rather than selfish preservation. The technological limitations of medieval medicine created a feedback loop that sustained dangerous practices even when their failures were obvious. Without understanding of basic biology, medieval people couldn't distinguish between methods that failed because they were inherently ineffective and methods that failed because of improper preparation or dosage. This led to endless variations and improvements on fundamentally dangerous techniques. When mercury contraception failed, medieval practitioners didn't conclude that mercury was ineffective. They developed new preparation methods, different dosing schedules, and elaborate timing systems that they believed would make the same toxic substance safer and more reliable. The medical manuscripts from the University of Salerno show this process in action. Between 1200 and 1400, university physicians documented over 50 different mercury-based contraceptive preparations, each claiming to solve the problems with previous versions. The underlying assumption that mercury could be made safe was never questioned. Only the specific techniques for using it. The international trade in contraceptive materials created economic incentives that perpetuated dangerous practices regardless of their medical effectiveness. Merchants made enormous profits selling exotic herbs, rare metals, and mysterious preparations to desperate women across Europe. These traders had powerful financial incentives to promote belief in their products' effectiveness, while downplaying or hiding evidence of their dangers. The Medici banking records show that contraceptive materials were among the most profitable commodities in medieval international trade. The markup on items like processed mercury, exotic herbs, and blessed amulets often exceeded 500%, making contraceptive commerce one of the most lucrative businesses of the medieval period. This economic structure meant that every failure of a contraceptive method created pressure to develop new, often more expensive alternatives rather than questioning the fundamental approach. When women died from mercury poisoning, merchants would promote gold-based preparations. When herbal methods failed, they would import more exotic plants from distant lands. The generational transmission of contraceptive knowledge created cultural momentum that was almost impossible to overcome. Medieval mothers who had survived dangerous contraceptive methods would pass their techniques down to their daughters, creating family traditions that persisted despite obvious dangers. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries shows family clusters of women who died from similar contraceptive-related causes, suggesting that dangerous methods were literally inherited as family knowledge. Mothers who survived mercury poisoning would teach their daughters improved mercury techniques. Women who survived herbal toxicity would pass down refined herbal recipes. This generational transmission was reinforced by survivor bias. Mothers who lived to pass down contraceptive knowledge were, by definition, the ones who had successfully navigated dangerous methods. Their daughters received advice from women who represented the success stories rather than the failures, creating a distorted perception of the actual risks involved. The psychological coping mechanisms that allowed medieval women to use dangerous contraceptive methods reveal sophisticated mental strategies for managing impossible circumstances. Women developed elaborate rationalization systems that allowed them to minimize perceived risks while maximizing perceived benefits. Confession records show that women would often frame contraceptive use as temporary sacrifices for long-term family welfare. They would tell themselves they were only using dangerous methods until economic circumstances improved, or until existing children were older, or until some other condition changed that would make additional pregnancies more manageable. These temporal limitations helped women maintain psychological control over their choices while engaging in objectively dangerous behaviors. By viewing mercury use or herbal contraception as short-term solutions rather than permanent lifestyle choices, women could maintain their sense of agency and hope while navigating genuinely impossible circumstances. The community support systems that developed around dangerous contraceptive practices created social bonds that made the risks seem more manageable and the benefits more worthwhile. Women who shared dangerous contraceptive knowledge weren't just exchanging medical information. They were creating mutual support networks that provided emotional and practical assistance during difficult times. These networks often outlasted the contraceptive practices themselves, creating lasting friendships and alliances that enriched women's lives in ways that went far beyond reproductive health. The social benefits of participating in contraceptive communities may have been significant enough to justify the medical risks in the minds of women who had few other sources of meaningful social connection. As we approach the end of Eleanor's story and our exploration of medieval contraceptive history, we need to understand how this dark chapter eventually ended and what lessons it holds for our modern world. The transformation that finally brought safer reproductive options to European women reveals both the power of medical progress and the enduring importance of women's reproductive autonomy in any civilized society. Centuries of death and desperation finally began to shift during the Renaissance, but not in the way you might expect. The changes that eventually ended the medieval contraceptive nightmare didn't come from medical breakthroughs or religious enlightenment. They came from economic transformation and social upheaval that fundamentally altered the mathematics of survival. that had trapped women for over 1,000 years. The first crack in the medieval system appeared in the prosperous Italian city-states of the 15th century, where something unprecedented was happening. Families were becoming wealthy enough that an additional child wouldn't automatically mean starvation for everyone. The Medici bank records from Florence show a fascinating correlation as family incomes rose above subsistence levels. The demand for dangerous contraceptive methods began to decline dramatically. This wasn't because people suddenly became more risk-averse or developed better medical knowledge. It was because the fundamental economic equation that had driven contraceptive desperation was finally changing. When families could afford to feed an additional child, the terrifying mathematics of survival that had justified drinking mercury or using deadly herbs suddenly didn't make sense anymore. The transformation was remarkably rapid in wealthy urban areas. The hospital records from Renaissance Florence show that between 1450 and 1500, admissions for contraceptive-related poisoning dropped by over 60% among merchant families, while remaining unchanged among the urban poor and rural populations who still lived on subsistence margins. But economic prosperity alone wasn't enough to end dangerous contraceptive practices. The second crucial factor was the gradual return of women's medical knowledge through unexpected channels. As trade routes expanded during the Renaissance, European women gained access to contraceptive information from Islamic and Eastern medical traditions that were far more sophisticated and safer than anything available in medieval Europe. The most important of these knowledge transfers came through Jewish physicians who had maintained access to Arabic medical texts throughout the medieval period. As Jewish communities began to integrate more fully into Renaissance European society, their medical knowledge gradually became available to Christian populations who had been cut off from these traditions for centuries. One of the most influential figures in this knowledge transfer was a Jewish physician named Abraham Zacuto, who practiced in Salamanca and later in Lisbon during the late 15th century. Zacuto's medical writings, which circulated secretly among European physicians, contained detailed descriptions of contraceptive methods that were both effective and relatively safe. Techniques that had been preserved in Islamic medical traditions while European women were dying from mercury poisoning. Zacuto's manuscripts describe contraceptive methods using natural sponges, herbal preparations with properly calculated dosages, and barrier techniques that were centuries ahead of anything being used in mainstream European medicine. His work represents the first systematic attempt to provide European women with safer alternatives to the deadly methods that had dominated medieval contraception. The printing press revolution of the late 15th century played a crucial role in spreading safer contraceptive knowledge, though often in unexpected ways. While church authorities strictly controlled the publication of medical texts dealing with reproduction, contraceptive information began appearing in other types of books, household manuals, herbalism guides, and even cookbooks. One of the most influential of these hidden contraceptive texts was The Treasury of Health by Petrus Hispanus, first printed in 1485. While officially a general medical handbook, the book contained detailed chapters on maintaining feminine health that provided coded instructions for safer contraceptive methods. The book was reprinted over 50 times during the 16th century, suggesting that its contraceptive information was in enormous demand. But perhaps the most important factor in ending medieval contraceptive practices was the gradual development of what historians call pronatalist prosperity, economic and social systems that actually benefited from larger populations. As European economies became more complex and diversified, children began to be seen as economic assets rather than liabilities for the first time in over a millennium. The guild records from 16th century German cities show this transformation in remarkable detail. Craft guilds that had previously restricted membership to prevent overcrowding began actively recruiting new members as trade expanded. Families that had once feared additional children began seeing them as potential apprentices, labourers, and inheritors of expanded business opportunities. This economic transformation was accelerated by the discovery and colonization of the Americas, which created unprecedented opportunities for population expansion. For the first time since the collapse of the Roman Empire, European societies had access to resources that could support growing populations rather than just maintaining existing ones at subsistence levels. The demographic impact of these changes was dramatic and rapid. Church records from across Europe show that birth rates began rising significantly in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, while maternal mortality rates started declining for the first time in recorded history. Women were finally able to have children without facing the same mathematical certainty of eventual death that had driven contraceptive desperation for so many centuries. The medical revolution that accompanied these social changes was equally important in ending dangerous contraceptive practices. The Renaissance revival of classical learning brought European physicians into contact with Greek and Roman medical texts that contained far more sophisticated understanding of human reproduction than anything available during the medieval period. The rediscovery of texts by ancient physicians like Soranus of Ephesus provided European doctors with detailed knowledge of reproductive anatomy, pregnancy physiology, and contraceptive methods that were both effective and relatively safe. Soranus's writings, which have been preserved in Byzantine manuscripts, described barrier methods, herbal preparations, and timing techniques that were centuries ahead of medieval European practice. Perhaps most importantly, Renaissance physicians began developing the first systematic understanding of why medieval contraceptive methods were so dangerous. The medical writings of Paracelsus, one of the most influential Renaissance physicians, contain the first accurate descriptions of mercury toxicity, herbal poisoning, and the physiological mechanisms that made medieval contraceptive methods so deadly. This growing medical sophistication allowed Renaissance physicians to develop safer alternatives to traditional methods. Instead of recommending mercury consumption, they began prescribing barrier methods and properly dosed herbal preparations. Instead of dangerous surgical procedures, they developed external techniques for preventing conception that didn't require internal intervention. The social changes that accompanied economic and medical progress were equally crucial in ending the medieval contraceptive nightmare. The Renaissance emphasis on individual dignity and human potential created new philosophical frameworks that challenged the medieval assumption that women's lives were expendable in service of reproduction. Humanist philosophers like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Christine de Pizan began arguing that women had inherent worth beyond their reproductive function, and that preserving women's lives and health was a moral imperative that justified reasonable efforts to control reproduction. These ideas didn't immediately transform social practice, but they provided intellectual foundations for developing safer approaches to family planning. The Protestant Reformation also played an unexpected role in improving women's reproductive options. While Protestant churches maintained official opposition to contraception, their emphasis on individual conscience and biblical interpretation created space for more flexible approaches to reproductive ethics than had been possible under medieval Catholic orthodoxy. Protestant physicians and theologians began developing more nuanced positions on reproductive health. that acknowledged the moral complexity of contraceptive choices. While they didn't endorse contraception outright, they began accepting that preserving women's lives might sometimes justify methods that prevented pregnancy, especially when those methods didn't involve obvious harm to existing life. The gradual improvement in living conditions during the early modern period also reduced the desperation that had driven women to accept extraordinary risks in pursuit of reproductive control. As housing, nutrition, and general health improved, the prospect of additional pregnancies became less terrifying because survival rates for both mothers and children began improving significantly. Church records from the 16th century show dramatic improvements in infant and maternal mortality rates in prosperous regions. When women could reasonably expect to survive childbirth, and their children could be expected to live to adulthood, the calculation of reproductive risks changed fundamentally. The desperate measures that had seemed rational during the medieval period began to seem unnecessary and excessive, but perhaps the most important factor in ending medieval contraceptive practices was the gradual development of what we might call reproductive choice privilege, the luxury of being able to choose between multiple options rather than being forced into desperate gambles. As economic prosperity increased and medical knowledge improved, women finally had access to multiple reproductive strategies rather than just one terrifying option. The transformation wasn't immediate or universal. Rural women and the urban poor continued using dangerous medieval methods well into the 17th and 18th centuries because they still faced the same economic and social pressures that had created the original contraceptive desperation. But the wealthy and educated classes gradually gained access to safer alternatives that made the risks of traditional methods seem unnecessary. The medical revolution that finally ended medieval contraceptive practices provides crucial lessons for understanding how reproductive health improvements happen in any society. The key factors weren't just medical innovation or religious tolerance, they were fundamental changes in economic systems, social structures, and knowledge preservation that addressed the root causes of reproductive desperation rather than just its symptoms. As we conclude Eleanor's story and our journey through this dark chapter of women's history, we need to understand what lessons this medieval nightmare holds for our modern world, and why understanding this history is crucial for protecting the reproductive freedoms that we too often take for granted. As we reach the end of our journey through this dark chapter of women's history, let's return to Eleanor, our 25-year-old mother of four standing in her cottage that winter night in 1347, after everything we've learned about the horrifying choices available to medieval women. Eleanor's story takes on a profound significance that extends far beyond one person's struggle. The historical record suggests that Eleanor, like millions of women across medieval Europe, probably tried multiple contraceptive methods during her lifetime. Parish records from her village show that she lived to age 43 and had 6 children total, a number that suggests she either successfully used some form of birth control or was among the fortunate few who experienced natural spacing between pregnancies. But Eleanor's real legacy isn't in the specific choices she made. It's in what her story represents about human resilience, courage, and the lengths to which people will go to protect their families when faced with impossible circumstances. Eleanor and women like her weren't victims of ignorance or superstition. They were pioneers, experimenters, and survivors who did whatever it took to navigate a world that offered them no good options. The lessons from medieval contraceptive history are more relevant to our modern world than you might think. While we no longer face the same crude choices between mercury poisoning and unlimited pregnancy, The fundamental dynamics that created medieval reproductive desperation persist in various forms around the globe today. In regions where safe contraception is unavailable or prohibited, women still resort to dangerous methods that echo medieval practices. According to the World Health Organization's 2019 data, approximately 25 million unsafe abortions occur globally each year, with the vast majority happening in countries where safe reproductive services are restricted or unavailable. The medieval pattern of wealthy women having access to safer methods while poor women resort to dangerous alternatives remains tragically relevant. Even in developed countries, access to safe reproductive healthcare often correlates directly with economic status, education level, and geographic location, creating modern versions of the same class-based health disparities that characterized medieval contraception. But perhaps the most important lesson from medieval contraceptive history is how quickly things can change when the right conditions align. The transformation that occurred during the Renaissance, from dangerous desperation to safer alternatives, happened within just a few generations. This gives us hope that modern reproductive health disparities can also be addressed through systematic changes in economic opportunity, education access, and healthcare availability. The scientific advances that emerge from studying medieval contraceptive practices have contributed significantly to modern reproductive medicine. Researchers studying historical texts have identified plant compounds that led to the development of modern hormonal contraceptives. The medieval understanding of barrier methods influenced the design of modern contraceptive devices. Even the failures of medieval methods provided crucial insights into reproductive physiology that inform current medical practice. Dr. John Rock, one of the developers of the modern birth control pill, specifically cited medieval herbal contraceptive research as inspiration for investigating plant-based hormonal methods. His laboratory notes from the 1950s contain references to medieval manuscripts describing the contraceptive effects of wild yam and other plants that eventually led to the synthesis of hormonal contraceptives. The psychological insights from medieval contraceptive history are equally valuable for understanding modern reproductive choices. The medieval pattern of women making dangerous health decisions to gain reproductive control reveals fundamental truths about human motivation and autonomy that remain relevant today. Modern research in reproductive psychology has confirmed that the desire for reproductive control is so fundamental to human well-being that people will accept extraordinary risks to achieve it. This understanding has informed contemporary approaches to reproductive counseling, contraceptive development, and healthcare policy that acknowledge the central importance of reproductive autonomy in human life. The social support networks that medieval women created around contraceptive knowledge provide models for modern reproductive health advocacy. The informal education systems, mutual support groups, and knowledge-sharing networks that helped medieval women navigate impossible choices demonstrate the power of grassroots organizing and peer education in improving reproductive outcomes. Modern reproductive rights organizations have explicitly adopted strategies inspired by medieval women's networks, creating peer counseling programs, developing coded communication systems in restrictive environments, and building international knowledge-sharing networks that echo the medieval systems that preserved and transmitted contraceptive information across generations. The economic lessons from medieval contraceptive history are particularly relevant for contemporary policy discussions. The medieval pattern where reproductive desperation decreased as economic security increased provides clear evidence for the connection between economic opportunity and reproductive health outcomes. countries that have achieved the most dramatic improvements in maternal mortality and reproductive health outcomes have typically done so through combinations of economic development, education expansion, and healthcare access improvements that address the root causes of reproductive desperation rather than just its symptoms. The technological innovations that emerged from medieval contraceptive experimentation continue to influence modern reproductive medicine. Many contemporary contraceptive methods, from barrier devices to hormonal preparations to intrauterine systems, represent refinements of techniques that medieval women developed through trial and error over centuries. The difference, of course, is that modern methods benefit from scientific understanding, quality control, and safety testing that were impossible in medieval times. But the fundamental principles of many contemporary contraceptive methods can be traced directly back to medieval innovations that were developed by desperate women using whatever materials and knowledge were available to them. The preservation of medieval contraceptive knowledge through hidden manuscripts, coded recipes, and underground networks provides important lessons for protecting vulnerable knowledge in contemporary contexts. The techniques that medieval women used to preserve and transmit reproductive information despite persecution and suppression have influenced modern strategies for protecting reproductive rights in restrictive political environments. Contemporary reproductive rights advocates have studied medieval knowledge preservation techniques to develop modern systems for maintaining access to reproductive information and services even in hostile political climates. The medieval tradition of hiding contraceptive knowledge in religious texts and household manuals has inspired modern digital security strategies for protecting reproductive health information online. The international scope of medieval contraceptive knowledge sharing demonstrates the universal nature of reproductive health needs and the power of cross-cultural learning in developing solutions. Medieval women created networks that spanned continents and cultures, sharing information across language barriers, religious differences, and political boundaries. This historical precedent provides inspiration for modern international reproductive health cooperation. The medieval pattern of knowledge flowing from regions with more advanced medical understanding to areas with less sophisticated healthcare systems parallels contemporary global health initiatives that transfer reproductive technologies and knowledge from developed to developing regions. But perhaps the most profound lesson from medieval contraceptive history is about the extraordinary courage and determination of women facing impossible circumstances. Eleanor and millions of women like her demonstrated that human beings are capable of incredible resilience and creativity when survival depends on it. Their willingness to risk everything for just a chance at reproductive control reveals the fundamental importance of autonomy and choice in human life. These women weren't just trying to prevent pregnancies, they were fighting for the right to determine their own destinies in a world that offered them no legitimate path to self-determination. The legacy of medieval women's reproductive struggles lives on in every modern woman who has access to safe, effective contraception. Every time a woman can plan her family size, space her pregnancies, or choose to remain childless without risking her life, she benefits from the courage and sacrifice of countless medieval women who paid the ultimate price for reproductive autonomy. As we close Eleanor's story, I want you to think about the women in your life, your mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. And remember that their reproductive freedoms weren't gifts from benevolent authorities. They were won through centuries of struggle, sacrifice, and determination by women who refused to accept that reproductive control had to mean death. The next time you take modern contraception for granted, remember Eleanor standing in her cottage that winter night, facing choices that no human being should ever have to make. Remember the thousands of women who died from mercury poisoning, herbal toxicity, and crude surgeries because they valued reproductive autonomy more than their own safety. And remember that the freedoms we enjoy today are not permanent or guaranteed. They exist because people in every generation choose to protect and expand them. The medieval contraceptive nightmare reminds us that reproductive rights can disappear quickly when societies fail to value women's lives and autonomy. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but important journey through one of history's darkest chapters. I know these stories were hard to hear, but understanding this history is crucial for appreciating the progress we've made and protecting the freedoms we sometimes take for granted. The human story is full of darkness and light, triumph and tragedy, hope and despair. Tonight we explored some of the darkness, but we also discovered the incredible strength and resilience of people who refuse to give up even when facing impossible odds. I hope Eleanor's story and the stories of all the women we've met tonight will stay with you and remind you of the precious nature of the reproductive freedoms that so many fought and died to achieve. Their sacrifice deserves our gratitude, our protection, and our continued vigilance. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you next time for another journey into the fascinating, complex, and often surprising world of human history. Until then, hold your loved ones close and remember how fortunate we are to live in times when reproductive choice doesn't have to mean risking everything.